The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 51. Franz the Question Writer. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was forced to receive an education and could no longer point out the country on a map. The gentleman who came today was wearing a top hat, a brown turtleneck coat, and a pair of riding boots. When he saw Franz, he took off his hat and saluted. "Hello, distinguished Archduke Franz. I'm Aaron Aberdeen. I'm honored to be invited by the Habsburg royal family. From today on, I will teach you." Franz nodded in response. This was not because Franz was arrogant, but because court etiquette required that a person in a higher position should not speak to a person in a lower position first, unless it was an order or request. In fact, European-style education in this era is completely unrelated to the so-called happy education. Every priest will hold a teaching stick or a pointer in his hand. If a student makes a mistake or fails to answer a question, he will enjoy a severe beating. Although they would not greet Franz, Thalia would suffer, who made her Franz's tutor. Originally, Thalia was full of confidence. After all, she was one of the few female college graduates in this era, and she had also won the first place in the Prime Minister's office clerk examination. During the few years that Thalia taught Franz, she felt that she had given everything she knew to Franz, but Thalia never expected that these kind-hearted university professors would directly give college questions to a child who has just started school. What Thalia didn't expect even more was that Franz actually gave the wrong answer on purpose. This Mr. Aberdeen was no exception. When he found that addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division could not trouble the child in front of him, he couldn't help but secretly curse this female teacher for being such a pervert. She was simply inhumane after teaching so many things to a child. But as a professor, he couldn't lose face, and he didn't want to deliberately create some weird problems. Suddenly, he had an idea. This trick can not only save your face, but also allow you to get off work early. Archduke Franz, you have worked very hard, and now I'm going to give you a new question. Please calculate the sum from 1 plus 2 plus 3 to 1000. We will end the get out of class when you figure it out. Of course, if you haven't calculated it today, you can continue to calculate it tomorrow. Aberdeen wore a foxy smile. Thalia was a little displeased. Who are these people? Do they have no morals at all? Is this the intention, to use Franz as a coolie? Franz took out a piece of tissue paper and looked at Thalia. Thalia immediately covered her mouth and whispered, "You can't figure it out, right?" Franz smiled and asked, "Do you think I can figure it out?" Thalia clasped her hands together and raised them above her head. "If you figure it out, I'll tell you good news." "How good is it?" Before Thalia could speak, Professor Aberdeen slammed his pointer on the table. "Shut up and don't disturb Archduke Franz's calculations." Thalia had no choice but to shut up and look at Franz. Franz wrote a line of crooked numbers on his paper. Franz looked at Professor Aberdeen, who was a little surprised. "Finished?" "Yes, Professor Aberdeen." Professor Aberdeen walked next to Franz and saw 500,500 written clearly on the paper. "Oh my God, what a genius!" Aberdeen exclaimed, and then thought it was impossible. It was probably this woman who was causing trouble. Then Aberdeen thought of another question. There is a piece of green grass on the pasture that grows at the same rate every day. This piece of grass can be eaten by 10 cows for 20 days, or it can be fed by 15 cows for 10 days, and the grass will continue to grow during this period. If it is fed by 25 cows, how many days can you eat cows? 5 days. Franz replied without thinking. This was not because Franz really had any amazing mathematical talent, but because he had heard this story. As long as Aberdeen changed the numbers at random, Franz would have to recalculate it. If Aberdeen brought the problem exactly, Franz would naturally know the answer. Aberdeen was now so shocked that he fell to his knees and burst into tears. "You are really a genius. As long as you study with me, I guarantee that you will become a great mathematician in the future." Thalia clapped her hands to signal the guards to come. "Another crazy one. Take him away." The guards were no longer surprised. Mrs. Sophie had ordered that those who wanted Franz to specialize in a certain technology or join an organization could be thrown out without asking. After all, Mrs. Sophie wanted a king, not an expert in a certain field. In fact, Mrs. Sophie was more afraid that Franz would become a master craftsman like Louis XVI. Guillotine or something. That's terrible. The guards held up Professor Aberdeen and dragged him out, but he still did not forget to speak to Franz. The Austrian mathematics community needs you, Archduke Franz. Franz shrugged, and Thalia was already laughing her head off. I thought you only had those beautiful aunts in your mind. When Franz came to this world, one of the few pastimes he had was looking at beautiful women. However, due to the backward Macu technology and the generation gap in aesthetics, most beauties in this era only have a sense of horror in Franz's eyes. Among the women Franz had seen, only Madame Sophie, Thalia and Aunt Ludwika, the mother of Princess Sissy and Princess Nana, could be considered beauties. This has something to do with the Emperor. Francis II was already very old, and the female officials and maids in the palace had followed him for decades. Later Ferdinand I don't think he had this need. After all, his wife, Queen Anna, had to find a lover to solve the problem. As a result, the miserable situation of nuns everywhere in Schönbrunn Palace was caused. Thalia, where's the good news? You said. Franz waved twice the whip he had just stolen from Professor Aberdeen. Okay. The seeds of the rubber tree have been brought back. Is this good news? Franz nodded. He could finally plant rubber trees in Zenla, which is an important raw material for future industry. Historically, Brazil has monopolized the rubber trade for a long time, resulting in the inability of many industries to expand on a large scale due to cost issues. Great. I will ask my mother for a delicious meal in the evening. If you have free time, mail these seeds to Grand Duke Ambrosius and ask him to find a way to promote cultivation in Chenla. Franz suddenly noticed Thalia lowering her head and fidgeting with her fingers and asked, "What's wrong? What else do you want to say?" Thalia smiled sheepishly. "Franz, I have some bad news to tell you." Franz's expression hardened. "Explain." "We got the seeds, but Mr. Costa said we have to pay more." Franz was speechless for a while. He didn't expect that the royal family could also be ripped off. But then I thought about it. Thalia would definitely not reveal her identity. Seeing that Thalia was generous and a woman, the other party made an impromptu decision and raised the price point. But when I think about it, it's wrong. She was obviously given it into installments, and there was a contract. Could it be that Costa is crazy? Then he looked up and down Thalia. Thalia was tall, with long golden hair hanging freely, exquisite facial features, fair skin, and the special temperament of an aristocratic scholar of this era. As long as she doesn't smile, she really gives people a cold, arrogant and stunning feeling. The points that must be deducted are her shoulder width, which is comparable to that of man, and those two small tiger teeth. Have you been harassed? Chapter 50 to Costa's plan. Schönbrunn Palace. Small classroom. Thalia nodded subconsciously and said, "There's nothing I can do about it." Franz's face darkened. It was not a problem to do Thalia a small favor and deal with the man who was harassing her, but it is very problematic for Thalia to hide from Franz and use Franz's hand to do things for herself. This is intolerable as a superior, and Franz must let Thalia know that he was wrong. Thalia is not a stupid woman. She immediately realized that she was wrong. She deceived a sensitive superior. She regretted being smart because she betrayed Franz's trust in her, and the lost trust is not easy to repair. Acting like a baby is a woman's natural weapon, and Thalia never thought that she would have to act like a baby to a child. I don't want to be pursued by a man with a beard at all. I'm only 22 years old. I don't want to get married. I still want to take care of you. In fact, 22-year-old Thalia is definitely considered an old girl among old girls in this era, when 16-year-olds give birth to babies. Lie to me. Franz also pretended to be very angry, and he couldn't coax him. Thalia pestered Franz for a while, and when she was done coaxing him, she changed the subject. Mr. Costa proposed a new deal. He did not find the legendary Golden City, but he found a kind of wheat he had never seen before, and brought back a batch of seeds. Wheat. Seeds. Isn't the Amazon a tropical rainforest? Franz asked with some confusion. Yes, when Mr. Costa was looking for the remains of the Golden City, he accidentally discovered a village that had been abandoned for many years. This kind of crop was grown in the open space of the village. Thalia explained. Thalia, you've seen that wheat. Right, yes, it looks taller and bigger than common wheat. I grew a lot of wheat at home in the past. Even the plumpest wheat is not as good as the sample brought back by Mr. Costa. Maybe it can really be improved of wheat. But he hopes to receive 100,000 florins as his reward. 100,000 florins is not an unbearable number for Franz now. However, Franz had already paid 50,000 florins for Costa's expedition, and the remaining payment was exactly 100,000 florins. But now no one can be sure whether the seeds brought by Costa are real or fake. Maybe it is just a single individual point. Maybe Franz could use artificial pollination to hybridize it with local wheat and create a new variety. Franz knew the theory, but never practiced it. Speaking of these wheat seeds that may increase yields, the risks involved are too great to be worth another 100,000 florins from Franz, and according to the contract, whatever Costa found and brought back, half should be given to the patron. In other words, if Franz wants to buy all the seeds, he should pay Costa an additional 50,000 florins. Thalia, you didn't explain that we should have half of his profits. Costa said he was free to price these things at whatever price he wanted, unless I was willing to spend the night with him. He sold me the wheat seeds for 50,000 florins. Thalia gritted her teeth with hatred. She seemed really unhappy. Franz originally wanted to tease her, but now it seems that he should not bring trouble on himself. Thalia, do you think that with just a few words from him, someone would be willing to pay 100,000 florins to buy the wheat seeds in his hands? Thalia wasn't surprised and just answered slowly. If it were an ordinary nobleman, even a big landowner would not accept this price, because the gain outweighs the loss. Indeed, even if the seeds are as he said, it will take a year just to gather enough seeds for sowing. And at the current grain prices in Austria, even if there are 10,000 acres of land, it will take nearly 10 years to recover the cost. And it is impossible to keep the matter of high quality and improved seeds a secret for 10 years. It is indeed more gain than loss, Franz said. Seeing Franz say this, Thalia knew that Franz had made up his mind, because she knew that Franz was not a small nobleman. He was considering the entire country. Then, let's continue planting rubber. I heard that the seeds of rubber trees are difficult to survive. You know that, so I bought so many. Thalia deliberately changed the subject. Rubber needs to be planted, and wheat needs to be tried. Franz said quickly. Thalia, how much do you think we can get these seeds for? I think it's most suitable to do it without money. It was obvious that Thalia wanted to make a business without capital. Thalia, how did that man pursue you and make you hate him so much? Thalia didn't answer, just smiled cruelly. It seems that women are very cruel creatures to men they don't like. Okay, just try not to cause any loss of life, Franz said. Thalia patted her chest and said that she had everything covered, but she needed someone to help her. Franz asked, who is that man? Colonel Hustle. Colonel Zassel is Mrs. Sophie's attendant. He is from Bavaria. He always fulfills Mrs. Sophie's orders by any means necessary, so he is deeply trusted by Mrs. Sophie. Moreover, Colonel Zassel also had close ties with a gang composed of Bavarians in Vienna. This gang is not big, but no gang dares to challenge it. A large part of the reason comes from a legend. The real behind the scenes leader of this gang is Mrs. Sophie, and Zassel is the messenger as the eldest son of Mrs. Sophie. Franz naturally had no reason to refuse when he asked Colonel Zassel for help. It's just that Zassel is a very shrewd person and is not easy to deceive. If Franz does something strange, Zassel will probably report it to Mrs. Sophie immediately. But because of this, Zassel will not tell the secret and will only tell Mrs. Sophie. Vienna, Turnstrasse, Grizzly Hotel. This is the edge of Vienna, the legendary ghetto. Costa lost half of his manpower during the expedition because he failed to find the legendary Golden City. The dangers involved are self-evident, not only facing bad weather, but also facing countless poisonous insects and beasts and terrible diseases. Costa understands that his good fortune cannot last forever. He is tired of this life and wants to go ashore. Although Costa was paid 3 times as much as the expedition leader, the proceeds from the expedition were not enough to pay for the rest of his life. But now he has an opportunity in front of him. If he falls in love with this rich lady in front of him, he will not have to worry about food and clothing for the rest of his life. Although he had only met this young lady a few times, he knew that a family that required women to show up frequently would most likely not have a male heir, and he might be able to inherit a noble title in the future. Of course, Costa could also see that the lady was not interested in him. But fortunately, he got a magical drug among the primitive tribes in the Amazon rainforest, which can cause strong hallucinations. Chapter 53 Business Without Capital. Costa believed that Miss Taylor would definitely come to see him again. Although she tried her best to conceal her interest in the high-yielding wheat, her eyes could not deceive anyone. For the seeds of this high-yielding wheat, Costa has to thank another of his patrons, a botanist from France. The French botanist not only paid for it, but also took the same boat with Costa's expedition to the Amazon rainforest. Thanks to this well-informed botanist along the way, Costa and his expedition were prevented from being destroyed by accidentally eating poisonous plants deep in the rainforest. They found the ruins, but unfortunately there was no gold or jewelry. Just when everyone was disappointed and ready to leave, the French botanist shouted excitedly, saying that he had discovered a treasure. The members of the expedition pushed the botanist away but only saw a wheat field. Everyone couldn't stop saying the botanist was crazy. But the excited botanist began to introduce his discovery to everyone. He said that this kind of wheat can increase wheat production in Europe by at least 10%. It is a food that can change the destiny of mankind, and he will be remembered by this history. However, he was eventually forgotten by history. The expedition team members, motivated by the wealth, killed the botanist and buried him under the wheat field. The expedition team members stole the results of the botanists, but after returning to Europe, no one bought their account. Not only were the seeds not sold, but they were regarded as cheaters and expelled repeatedly. At this time, they remembered their other patron and the rubber tree seed soaked in the water tank. Now Costa and his men regard Thalia as a fat sheep and want to make a lot of money. Boss, Miss Taylor is here. A bald man dressed as a farmer walked into the house, interrupting Costa's memories. Great, invite her over quickly, Costa said, pouring the powder into the teapot and shaking it well. After a while, the door was pushed open and the bald man walked in with Miss Taylor and a young gentleman. Costa was a little confused. Why was there another person before? Aren't her bodyguards standing at the door? Thalia smiled and said, please allow me to introduce you. This is Professor Züssel from the University of Vienna. He is a botanist. When he heard the botanist, the corners of Costa's mouth twitched twice. It returned to normal immediately. Miss Taylor left at that time to find a botanist to inspect the goods, which can be explained. Nice to meet you, Mr. Hustle. My name is Costa, a professional explorer. Nice to meet you, Mr. Costa. Miss Taylor said that you had discovered a new variety of wheat. At this time, Züssel specially found a wig and looked like a retro scholar. Yes, I found this in one of the ruins in the Amazon rainforest. Costa was eloquent and began to tell stories about his adventures again, while making secret glances at Thalia. Züssel didn't want to hear nonsense, so he had to interrupt him and said, can I see the sample? Sure. Züssel had some knowledge of botany, and he was sure that this was wheat, just larger than the European ones. Züssel took out a handheld magnifying glass from his coat pocket, looked at it for a long time, crushed a few grains with his hands, smelled it, and then said seriously, it's not wheat, it's the food of the Incas, quinoa. Costa was completely confused. Was he deceived? Züssel was well prepared. He immediately took out a thick plant encyclopedia, dipped a little saliva on his fingers, flipped through the book, finally stopped on a page, and handed it to Costa. The picture on the page is very similar to the new variety of wheat in front of me, and the note next to it clearly says that quinoa is a food of the Incas and originated in South America. Costa was a little speechless. He didn't expect that, after killing people and grabbing treasures, what he got in the end was worthless junk. At this time, Züssel felt that the heat was coming, and continued, Miss Taylor, quinoa may appear in different colors when mature, and it is very beautiful. Why don't you buy some and plant them in your garden? It is also a very good choice. Failure pretended to be embarrassed. Now that you say so, I will pay 10,000 florins for these quinoa seeds. Zassel struck while the iron was hot. Mr. Costa, it's rare to see someone as generous as Miss Talia. Costa gritted his teeth. He didn't know how much the quinoa was worth, but he knew that, if it was what the botanist said, these seeds would definitely rot in his hands instead of making nothing at all. It would be better to make 10,000 florins first. Okay, it's a deal for Miss Thalia's sake. Thalia took out another check and wrote the amount of 10,000 florins on it. Costa was a little depressed, fearing that his 50,000 florins would be wasted. But he had other plans and braced himself. Miss Talia, I have prepared the seeds of the rubber tree. I can send someone to pick them up whenever you want them. Have you brought your check? Of course, the check is right here. A check guaranteed by Rothschild Bank. Thalia took out the check and put it on the table. Costa checked it and saw that the check was genuine, so he smiled and said, Miss Thalia, I wish us a happy cooperation. Let's have a cup of tea together. Costa picked up the teapot and poured a cup of tea for Thalia. This is the best English black tea. Thalia picked up the teacup, smelled it, and said with a smile, it is indeed good tea. But Thalia did not drink directly, but said, Mr. Costa, I want to make a contract, which will be good for both of us. No problem, I'll get the paper. Costa turned and left. After Costa left, Thalia took Costa's cup over and smelled it, and then changed the positions of the two cups. Thalia's operation made Zassel a little confused. After a while, Costa returned to the room with the banknotes and the seal. You've been waiting for a long time, Miss Thalia. Please, the two parties soon drew up a contract, and Thalia touched the teacup and said, Mr. Costa, if you don't drink tea, it will be cold. I wish us a happy cooperation. Thalia drank the tea in one gulp, and Costa touched the teacup. The temperature was just right and drank the tea in one gulp. Mr. Zassel, thank you very much for today. Wherever you live, I will ask my men to take you back. Costa is expelling guests, and Thalia wants to wait for the seeds of the rubber tree, so she wants to stay. Zassel looked at Thalia, and Thalia nodded, indicating that it was okay. Costa had Zassel sent away, returned to the room very excitedly, and then suddenly said, you will be mine soon. What did you say? Thalia asked. Costa realized that he had said something wrong, and wanted to correct it, but suddenly everything in front of him became distorted. He couldn't even stand still, and staggered back to his seat. Where am I? Costa said. Thalia knew it must be the cup of tea, and smiled. I've never had any good tea at Franz's, and I know there's something wrong with your tea. As soon as I smell it, give me back my check, or I'll go to the gendarmerie to sue you. Thalia wanted to scare the man in front of her, but the man in front of her actually took out the check. Did he lose consciousness? Thalia thought to herself. Those checks were certified by the contract, and it was impossible for the military police to get them back for Thalia. Then, you tear up the contract too. Costa took out the contract and tore it into pieces. Do you still have quinoa seeds? Costa nodded. Where's the rest? Costa pointed to a large box next to her. Thalia opened the box and found a bag of wheat seeds and a small bag of powder that smelled very fragrant. Thalia put her things away and waved at the window. Someone below opened a big net, and Thalia jumped into it. Thalia's entourage left after getting the seeds of the rubber tree. Costa's men were a little strange and wanted to enter the room to see the situation, but men's moans were heard from time to time in the room. Chapter 54. Who is the most powerful? Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. The rubber seeds have been sent directly to the royal greenhouse, waiting for seedlings to be cultivated and then shipped to Chenla, so that Ambrosius and the people of the church can promote planting in Chenla. The cycle of rubber trees is very long. It takes 8 years to start tapping, and it takes 5 years for rubber tapping to reach its peak. Franz looked at the check and wheat seeds in front of him. He felt that Thalia had gone too far. What's going on with these 100,000 florins? But you signed a contract. You are a robber, a westerner who has no spirit of contract at all. Thalia spread her hands indifferently. Now that the contract is gone, do we still need to abide by it? Where's the contract? He tore it off himself. It's none of my business. How is that possible? Thalia made a stop sign and took out a bag from the pocket of her skirt. This is a gift for you. You will need it in the future. Thalia thought for a while and added, I hope you won't need it. Costa tore up a contract himself. How is that possible? Franz asked. Thalia pointed to the bag on the table. The powder in this makes people feel powerless and submissive. Costa did something to my tea. Franz looked at Thalia and asked curiously, you okay? Of course I'm fine. He suffered the consequences. Thalia said very proudly. Well, it seems he has received the punishment he deserves. Franz looked at the check on the table and thought that, since it was issued anyway, he might as well spend it directly. Thalia, things were done well. Do you want any reward? Thalia looked at Franz in surprise. What was this little kid thinking? Do you want to control me? Thalia suddenly remembered that she seemed to be Franz's person now. Reward. Thalia rolled her eyes. In other words, do you have any dreams? Dream. I want to study like a man, be an official, and then have people worship me. Thalia seemed to remember the stupid things she had done. As a stronghold of conservative forces in Europe, women in Austria had just gained the right to receive education at this time, and women were not allowed to enter universities, let alone become officials. How about I help you build a women's college and let you be the principal? In this way, you can become an official and be worshipped by others. Franz suggested. Can you be admired by others if you become the principal? Thalia asked. Let me ask you, who is the most powerful person in the zoo? Franz asked. Tiger, elephant. Thalia did not have a definite answer to this question. It's the director. Thalia suddenly understood and felt that what Franz said made sense. Only then did she realize. Women's college? Question mark. This was an unprecedented event because there had not been a school specifically for girls in Vienna before. It was not until 1835 that Ferdinand I approved a decree allowing women to attend school. But there was no compulsory education in Austria at that time. Going to a public school or hiring a tutor usually meant expensive tuition. Church schools or private schools established by nobles have strict requirements for admission. The extremely high literacy rate in the Austrian Empire is the best proof of this. Austria implemented completely free compulsory education during the era of Queen Nassau and Joseph II, but it was completely abolished under Leopold I. After the Napoleonic War. Francis II briefly recovered, but his finances could not make ends meet, so he asked the school to find a way on its own. The illiteracy rate of 70% plus can only be matched by Russia in the East. Franz, are you serious? The establishment of a women's college requires the approval of His Majesty the Emperor. Thalia touched Franz's forehead in a gesture. What's the point? I'm Franz. Franz wasn't bragging. Although Franz didn't dare to interfere in national affairs easily, as long as it didn't involve the national level. Even if Franz had to be in the Central Garden of Vienna tomorrow, no one would object to building a playground in the Vienna Central Cemetery. Oh, so I can be the principal? Of course, I have 2 manor houses in the north of the city that can be turned into schools. It faces the Danube River in front, has the Karen Mountain in the back, and is surrounded by mountains and rivers. It is a good place to build a school. Even the houses are ready-made. Anyway, I won't live there, so I'll leave it to you. Thalia had seen it from a distance before. They were 2 beautiful royal estates. She hugged Franz very excitedly, and Franz, who was weak, pitiful, and helpless, was squeezed so hard that he couldn't breathe. Thalia suddenly let go of Franz, and she thought of another problem. There were only a few weirdos like her in the whole of Austria, and 3 of her seniors had been burned to death. She herself was almost hanged in the Prime Minister's office, in front of the door, on the chestnut tree. Where should I recruit students? There are not many girls in Austria who have received high school education, let alone girls who want to go to university. Women graduating from university in Austria face a major problem. That is, there are no jobs suitable for them. They can only choose to support their husbands and raise children, or work as tutors in other noble families. Therefore, in the Austrian Empire, women's education usually stopped at reading and writing. It's simple. We don't have it in Austria. Can we recruit from foreign countries? and the courses don't have to be taught like ordinary universities. We can completely tailor the courses for you. Simple courses such as etiquette, housework, calculations, languages, literature, and theology are taken together with complex subjects such as economics, law, society, psychology, natural sciences, engineering, and mechanics. You can start in elementary school and then move on to middle school, high school, and college. Anyway, the women's college in Vienna is still blank. Failure was speechless. Where can I find so many female teachers? The ladies of the Viennese court, those who have retired, and those who are too old to continue working at the court. You want to change to something young and beautiful, right? In fact, Franz wants to implement compulsory education for all, but under the current situation, this project is impossible to pass. Even if the emperor approved it, it would be rejected by Korolev and Metternich of the Regency Council, because Austria's finances simply could not support it. The French used their influence to reduce bank lending to the Austrian Empire and deliberately suspended construction of railways contracted by French merchants. Friedrich List also used the connections he established while working in the Austrian Empire to provide benefits to Austrian officials and let them make things difficult for railway construction. Hungary has introduced a new bill to refuse the sale of pig iron, sand, gravel, and logs to Austria. Although Hungary is not the main supplier of Austrian railways, the original suppliers saw this bill and demanded price increases. This caused the businessmen in the Austrian Empire, who were originally enthusiastic about investing in the railway, to be enveloped in panic and sell their railway stocks one after another. The result of the outflow of funds was a large-scale shutdown. Count Korolev and Prince Metternich were also arguing over whether to protect the south or the north. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 55 Not Drunk. After the death of Francis II, Metternich closely tied his own interests to those of the Rothschild family in order to seek support. This also caused the status of the two to be interchanged. Now Metternich has to rely on the power of the Rothschild family. In order to drive Prince Metternich out of the core of power in Austria, Count Korolev carried out extensive cooperation with the forces in Italy. Although the country's fiscal revenue increased, it was not enough to offset the joint attacks of France, Prussia, and Hungary. Those businessmen who were still ambitious 2 years ago are now considering how to sell their business rights. Contrary to the booming railway construction in other countries, Austrian railways are currently in a cold winter. Half of the railway construction is in a state of suspension. Without new capital injection, the remaining half will also enter a state of suspension sooner or later. Ferdinand's chief advisor was also very busy at this time. After Baron Bruck took the power in his hands, he realized that it was a hot potato. Karl von Schlüter simply did not have the ability to borrow more loans for the Austrian Empire. This was also an important reason why Austria's finances collapsed to such an extent. At the same time, Baron Bruck was on the other side of the ocean, doing something that made him very excited. In the first 6 months of 1836, he had successfully cashed out $6 million in precious metals from the United States, and used $10 million to cash out banknotes and precious metals worth a total of £2 million on the London Exchange. Baron Bruck has sold 45% of his land, and even so he has netted 10 times his profit. Now, as long as all the remaining land can be sold and exchanged for silver and gold, the total income of Franz Karel Archduke will reach $35.55 million as long as Franz Karel deposits this money in the bank. Many of Austria's problems can be solved. Because the cold winter of railway construction in Austria was entirely caused by man-made factors. When Austrian railway construction was suspended, Saxony proposed to acquire Austrian railway sections, but was rejected. Of course, not only Saxony, but also the famous poor country Bavaria has applied for acquisition. According to the quotations of the two countries, as long as the railways leading to the two countries are sold to them, the problem Austria is facing now can be solved. But this is unacceptable. The railway is in the hands of other countries. Not to mention the unwillingness of those businessmen. Even the military cannot accept it. The businessmen of this country can still refuse to serve the Austrian army. If other countries are allowed to take control of their own railways, they may directly transport enemy troops to Vienna, and then shout the enemy is at Honaju Temple. According to Baron Bruck's estimation, as long as Austria survives this crisis, people will regain confidence in the railway. As for Karl von Sloot, Bruck didn't take him seriously at all, just treating him as a clown. At this time, Baron Bruck had already admired the Archduke Franz Karl. He believed that the Archduke Franz Karl was not stupid, but just a silent economist. As expected, geniuses are difficult to understand. At this time, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Archduke Franz Karl was feeding the fish and drinking wine by the fountain. When he saw that the fish were almost floating, he scooped up a handful with his hands. This doesn't taste good either. You guys are too drunk. When Franz Karl saw his son coming over, he quickly invited Franz Joseph to sit down. Son, try it. Franz Joseph looked at the water held in his father's hand and didn't think much about it. He licked it with his tongue and felt it was a little sweet and a little spicy. Father, what is this? Is it a specialty of Schönbrunn Palace? No, it's wine. Wine. Why is there wine here? I poured it. At this time, a dead fish fell from the sky. Franz followed the direction in which the dead fish flew and found that the fountain was full of dead fish. Franz Joseph looked at the dead fish in the fountain again. What's going on with this fish? Your mother said she wanted to raise some fish, so I bought some fish. When I came back, I found that there was no place to raise them. Isn't there a big pond here? I was afraid that these fish would not be accustomed to living in their new home, so I came. Let's drink with them. Who knew they were so drunk? They're all drunk. Franz Karl told his glorious deeds vividly, and Franz Joseph sighed. Does mother know? Don't know yet. I'll have people clean this place up. Don't tell your mother about this. Next time you go to buy fish, can you buy a fish tank? Okay. Franz gave Talia a hint, and Talia quickly called on the nearby palace people to help catch fish. Before Franz Joseph could speak, Franz Karl continued. Smash. What's the matter with you, Franz? Joseph was a little curious. Why did this old man rush to answer? How do you know I have something to ask you for? You came here with wine, and you are usually against me drinking. Okay, father, here is an application. You can go to the emperor's uncle to approve it, then go to the regency council to get it stamped, and then bring it back to me. Then you must have a big drink with me. I only drink juice. Okay. In the evening, Karl von Sloot felt very depressed. Although he was the chief royal advisor, he was now being suppressed by a bullshit regency council. Isn't it true that all these years of hard work have been in vain? I have to pay public food to that woman at night. It's painful to think about it. He looked at the sleeping emperor again. It was simply wishful thinking to expect this guy to be able to suppress the guys in the regency council. He clearly should be the Caesar who is inferior to one person, but superior to 10,000 people. Yes, that's right. Karl von Sloot, should have been a Caesar, or at worst a Wallenstein. How could this happen? At this moment, the sound of someone's footsteps interrupted Karl von Sloot's contemplation. Damn it, this idiot smelling of alcohol. What is he doing here? Karl von Sloot cursed secretly in his heart. Then I thought about having some fun with this idiot, to make up for my hurt heart. Stop, His Majesty the Emperor has not summoned you, Franz. Karl ignored Karl von Sloot, and Karl von Sloot was very angry, and ran to Archduke Franz Karl again. Your Majesty is sleeping. No one is allowed to disturb you. I don't want to talk to you. Archduke Franz Karl replied, about to move forward. Karl von Sloot stopped Franz Karl again, and the argument between the two woke Ferdinand I. Karl von Sloot. I'm extremely sorry. I have informed Archduke Franz Karl that you are resting. But Archduke Franz Karl insisted on seeing His Majesty, and his subordinates could not stop him, which disturbed His Majesty, Ferdinand. I did not pay attention to Karl von Sloot's words and spoke directly. My stupid brother, what's the matter with you? My poor brother, can I beat him? Random. Archduke Franz Karl only had 3 hobbies. smoking, drinking, and perming his hair it was drinking, riding horses, and hunting, so Archduke Franz Karol's core strength was extremely strong. It shouldn't be too easy to beat up a civil servant. Karl von Slote's screams echoed in the Hall of Mirrors, and the royal guards nearby turned a blind eye, and some even snickered. Archduke Franz Karol wiped his hands on his clothes casually, and then took out a document. Franz plans to build a school and needs your special approval. Okay, Ferdinand. I made a stroke of his pen, and resumed his previous posture. My stupid brother, I'm tired. Please don't disturb me. I need to rest. Have a drink before going to bed to help you fall asleep faster. Archduke Franz Karol took out a military flask from his shirt pocket, placed it in front of the throne, then turned and left. Thank you to Book Friends Empire Sci for your monthly ticket and all readers for your support. This week is the second round of recommendation week. I also ask all readers for your support. I will try my best to write a good plot. Thank you. Chapter 56. Terrible Tasteless. Central Italy, the residence of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Archduke Leopold II looked with some surprise at the Austrian officials, who were swearing allegiance to him. Mr. Mourner, are you kidding me? Tuscany is just a small state under the rule of Austria, and Tuscany must also be loyal to Austria. Mourner was the Austrian special commissioner who came to Tuscany 2 years ago. Although Archduke Leopold II was a little unambitious, he was very kind and loved by the people. At the same time, he could listen to suggestions and do good things. This is simply the best boss for someone like Mourner, who is frustrated in Austrian officialdom. Of course, such people usually have lax governance and corruption among their subordinates. This is also an important reason why Tuscany's economy has not improved. These special envoys from Austria can remove these stubborn diseases for Tuscany. In 2 years, Tuscany not only built the railway to Modena and Lucca, but also expanded the small steel plant in Tuscany into the largest steel plant in central Italy. Central Italy lacks coal and iron resources, but it is not completely absent. The abolition of exorbitant taxes and miscellaneous taxes collected privately by officials and nobles revitalized the port of Valina. Tuscany has one of the largest mercury mines in Italy and even the world. During a raid by Austrian officials, 15 million florins were directly recovered as stolen money. In the following 2 years, output tripled. Tuscany's fiscal revenue jumped from less than 3 million florins in 1834 to 10 million florins with money. Tuscany expanded his army from 2,000 to 10,000 and built his own factory. Not only could he be self-sufficient in weapons, he could also sell them to other countries. Leopold II of Tuscany did not indulge in pleasure, but spent money on education and building public facilities. This moved the Austrian officials, who had suffered from wrangling and corruption, so much that they were willing to stay and serve the wise Archduke. Your Majesty, we swear allegiance to the Habsburg family, and you are also a member of the Habsburg family, so this is not a betrayal. Leopold II of Tuscany didn't really care, as long as someone took care of the country for him. And these people seemed to be much more useful than those native Tuscans. This Leopold II was completely different from Francis II. He never considered himself an Italian or an Austrian. In his heart, he has always been just a member of the Habsburg family, and those wise actions are nothing more than a family tradition. Even though Ferdinand I was unable to rule the country, causing chaos in Austria, Leopold II of Tuscany did not think Ferdinand I was at fault, because Ferdinand I just followed tradition when he inherited the throne. Scenes like this are frequently staged in the countries of China, Italy, and Italy. Of course, there are those who are frustrated and want to find a stage to show off their talents, and there are also those who are corrupt and want to find a place to scrape the land. For example, in Parma now, after Archduchess Mary Louise learned that her and Napoleon's only son had died, she squandered her life even more unscrupulously. As a special official of Austria, Oka, instead of helping restore order in the local area, instead fell into the favor of the Grand Duchess Mary Louise, looking for handsome young men and buying luxury goods for her. He soon gained the Grand Duchess's trust. Oka's source of income is, firstly, by exploiting the people of Parma, and secondly, by defrauding loans from Austria. As a supervisor, Oka kept himself in check and used the money from Austria's railway construction to provide for the Grand Duchess and his own enjoyment. At the same time, he also bought real estate in the United States and could directly immigrate to the United States when necessary. Ockle colluded with local corrupt officials and imposed rounds of extortionate taxes, making the people of Parma miserable. Those who could not survive gathered together and tried to demonstrate at the Duchess's mansion so that the Duchess could reduce taxes, but Oka directly reported to the nearby Austrian garrison that a mob planned to harm the Archduchess. The Austrian garrison became a knife in Oka's hand. The massacred citizens' resentment towards Austria increased, paving the way for future outbreaks. Francesco IV of Modena was a member of the Habsburg family, but he was a mediocre person. He could be said to be Zhang Zhanchang in the West. Francesco IV didn't know three things. First, he didn't know how much money he had. Second, he didn't know how many people he had. And third, he didn't know how many lovers he had. He once assigned his lover's husband to take his money, to recruit an army, to attack Napoleon. As a result, instead of recruiting troops, the man ran away with Francesco IV's money. Until his death, Napoleon did not know that such a person had ever prepared to send troops to attack him. Francesco IV's reign was chaotic, and he preferred calling in Austrian troops to maintaining an expensive army. The Austrian special officials were helpless in the face of this situation, and they all worked together with the Archduke. In the Papal States, the people still maintain an almost medieval life. There is a joke: if anyone is most opposed to the church in this era, it must be the Romans. The southernmost kingdom of the Sicily is ushered in the freest king in the history of this country, who was different from his father, who had ignored political affairs throughout his life. Ferdinand II took some measures from the Napoleonic era, reorganizing administration, caring about national welfare, reducing taxes, encouraging industry, promoting trade, allowing exiles to return, and even using some officials from Murat's era in his government. Ferdinand II established Italy's first railway, Naples Portage Railway, Italy's first navigation company, and Italy's first telegraph company. Then his people rebelled against his rule. Even shells were fired into his palace, but his liberal reforms continued. Franz knew very well that to integrate China and Italy, what was needed was a strong country and the establishment of a long-term and stable order. At this time, Austria was experiencing serious internal strife and was indeed unable to continue to protect the legacy left by the era of Francis II. It might be a wise move to temporarily give up integrating Central Italy. Compared to Central Italy, which was tasteless and a pity to abandon, Franz was more interested in what happened in another place. Carlos, who was defeated in the Spanish Civil War, first fled to England, but he did not get the support he wanted in England. The British government even felt that Carlos was a scourge that undermined European peace, and said that, as long as Carlos was willing to give up the throne and never return to Spain, the British government was willing to pay Carlos a pension of £30,000 per year. At that time, £30,000 was already a very large number. The annuity for male members of the Austrian royal family was usually 10,000 to 20,000 florins, and £30,000 was equivalent to about 300,000 florins. Of course, this pension would not be in vain. That's it. Carlos left England and went to France to seek help. Franz felt that Carlos did not let the French see his sincerity, so Franz decided to help him. Chapter 57. The successor. Carlos. King Fernando VII of Spain passed away on September 29, 1833. After learning the news, Carlos Maria Isidro, who was in Portugal at the time, declared himself King of Spain on October 1, 1833 and changed his name to Charles V. But as early as the day Ferdinand VII died, Queen Maria Cristina proclaimed Isabel II's accession to the throne, becoming King of Spain, and she herself became Isabel II's Queen Regent. On October 4, 1833, the Carolists launched an uprising. On October 17, Queen Regent Cristina announced that Carlos would be deprived of his title of prince and all his powers, and his property would be confiscated. The First Carolist War breaks out. In fact, in 1830, Fernando VII promulgated a bill similar to the Edict of State to abolish the Salic succession law and allow women to inherit the Spanish throne. The Edict of State met with widespread opposition, and most of the great nobles and high-ranking Catholics sided with Carlos, but Carlos himself lacked political wisdom and political skills. The Queen Regent and Carlos are essentially the same kind of person. They both hate liberalism, and do not regard people other than the nobility as human beings. She herself loves palace intrigue and strife, and the supreme authority of the monarch under an autocratic system. But the first thing she did, when she came to power, was to gain the support of liberals, and pretend to be close to the people. Although she was so disgusted with liberals and plebeians, she appointed a liberal leader of plebeian origins as Prime Minister of Spain. Then the Queen Regent made unrealistic promises to the great nobles and Catholic priests, claiming that not only would they safeguard their rights and interests, but they would even set up annuities to reward those who were loyal to Spanish orthodoxy. After some operations by Queen Regent Cristina, the balance of power between the two sides was directly reversed. Carlos publicly denounced the treachery of the great nobles and Catholic leaders, and stated that, after he ascended the throne, he would eliminate liberals from the country. In fact, in the history of Europe, this kind of hedging is not uncommon. However, Carlos did not understand the rules of the game and naively believed that he was the righteous party. However, he pushed many potential supporters towards Queen Regent Christie. Now his threats had no effect, and instead left him alone. At this time, Carlos could only rely on the farmers of Navarre, Vasconia, and Aragon, as well as the Saints Party, the ultra-conservative party, who had always supported him, and the separatists in Basconia and Catalonia, similar to local self-government groups in Hungary. But Carlos's supporters, except for the honest peasants, neither the noble priests nor the secessionists regarded Carlos as a king. What the nobility and the church valued about Carlos was his conservatism and his weakness of will. Carlos, who believed in religion, seemed to be a plaything in the hands of the priests. Similarly, the nobles did not think that the weak-willed Carlos dared to fight against the nobles. The Catholics and the nobles all hope that Carlos can become the best puppet in their hands. The separatists also felt that Carlos could better safeguard their freedom if they were in power. Because of the huge disparity in strength, the leader of the Carolist faction, General Sirima, adopted a guerrilla warfare strategy. From 1833 to 1835, not only were the Carolist guerrillas not defeated by the government forces, but they fought more and more, reaching a maximum strength of 70,000. Under the command of General Sirima, they completed several beautiful battles. The Spanish government forces were severely weakened. At this time, Carlos also swelled up, forgetting the days when he had to be carried on his back through the mountains, and ordered an army to be gathered to attack Bilbao. In this battle, under the personal command of Carlos, 20,000 troops were lost, General Sirima was killed, and Carlos had to go into exile. Carlos received support from the Orthodox in France, but not as much as he had imagined. In fact, French King Louis Philippe was very emotionally sympathetic to Carlos. With the acquiescence of Louis Philippe, France's ultra-royalists could enter and exit the country at will, provide money, supplies, and weapons to the Carolists, and even directly hire foreign soldiers to fight. French territory can also be used as a hiding place for the Carolists. Spanish government troops who want to cross the border will be ruthlessly rejected by the French army. Louis Philippe and the ultra-royalists had done much, but it was not enough. This has a lot to do with Carlos's reluctance to part with his old capital. Because he is extremely religious, he has never even made a promise to the French. That is to say, everything the French did before was done without asking for anything in return. They were simply the good guys of the 19th century. Carlos is a complete iron rooster, and now Franz is ready to let this iron rooster pluck its feathers. Carlos would never sell Spanish land, so he thought he had no leverage. In fact, he had a lot of leverage, such as his 3 sons. If Carlos uses his youngest son to marry France, he will definitely get twice as much support as now, and France will even openly support Carlos. If Carlos uses his heir to marry France, then the French will definitely support Carlos fully, and even directly send troops, if possible. Of course, Mr. Carlos cannot write. Carlos would never use his sons as leverage, but Franz would help him out. A letter to Louis Philippe, which would be obtained by Guizot or Thiers France, to allure his palace. Thiers clutched a letter, and was inexplicably excited. He thought that the time had come for France To return to its former glory. Carlos would marry his eldest son to the Orleans dynasty, which would change the landscape of Europe. It is not difficult to imagine how powerful a united kingdom of France and Spain will be one day in the future. Spain, which is now weak, has a glorious history. France will get back everything it has lost for Spain and integrate it into the glory of France. At that time, France would suddenly become a powerful force competing with Britain. As time goes by, it would eventually surpass and replace Britain as the world's hegemon. But fierce enthusiasm was poured cold water on by King Louis Philippe. Marriage with Carlos. The Queen of Spain has revoked Carlos's title of prince, and he is no longer the heir to the Spanish throne. Your Majesty, we can help Carlos ascend to the throne, so that the future King of Spain will have the blood of the Orleans dynasty. Fierce, I feel that getting involved in the Spanish Civil War is not in France's own interests. Let's forget it, since the king objected. Fierce had no choice but to leave angrily, but Louis Philippe's cowardice still made him very angry. Before Fierce left, he saw Gizet walking from the opposite side very excitedly. Mr. Gizet, why are you so light on your feet, Gizet? And Fierce had different ideas, but at this time Gizet greeted Fierce with a smile. Oh, Mr. Fierce, I believe you will be happy for France to know this news. What? Good news? Fierce asked. Spain is going to marry France, Gizet replied. Fierce's face darkened, and he thought to himself, this idiot is actually more caring than our king. But Fierce remained calm on the surface, and instead made a gesture of invitation to let Gizet go in front of him. He wanted to see Gizet's disappointment when he learned that the king opposed the marriage with Spain. Guess what happens next? Chapter 58. Queen Regent Christina. Your Majesty, good news. This is related to the future of France, the future of the dynasty, and even the future of Europe and the world. Louis Philippe was different from the mainstream monarchs of this era. He did not like to wear military uniforms and costumes, preferring more down-to-earth casual clothes to maintain his image as a citizen king. However, the public does not think highly of him. The upper class calls him the Barricade King, while the common people call him the Yali King. Yali means idiot. The reason is that he is different from the previous kings of France. Louis Philippe admires him very much. British-style politics, so delegate power to your ministers. As a result, Louis Philippe raised a group of shocking corrupt criminals, and the people's dissatisfaction with the French government was all tilted towards this hapless king. At this time, Louis Philippe was wearing casual clothes and smiling. Although he had already listened to Fierce's report once, he still acted like he was listening, as if he were a wise king in ancient times. Mr. Gizet, I feel that supporting Carlos and getting involved in the Spanish Civil War is not in France's interests. Your Majesty, Carlos. Gizet waved his hand quickly. No, please listen to me. Louis Philippe, however, did not let Gizet continue. I'm not an ultra-conservative like Sir Nicholas I'm loyal to France and the Charter. Tsar Nicholas I was very supportive of Carlos. He refused to recognize the Spanish government led by the Queen Regent and broke off diplomatic relations with it as soon as possible. He even publicly declared that a bitch and a slut are not worthy of leading Spain. Queen Regent Christina's personal life was very chaotic. As soon as her husband Ferdinando VII died, she took her lover into her palace and completed the wedding under the witness of a priest. Even on the night that Ferdinando VII died, she was still lingering with her lover. After that, she gave birth to a child for her lover every year and even raised her in the royal palace of Madrid. This made the ultra-conservative Tsar Nicholas I identify the regent Queen Christina as his sworn enemy. If the territories of Russia and Spain were connected, I'm afraid that the Cossack cavalry would have rushed into the royal palace of Madrid and killed the Queen Regent, her lover, and all the evils. Your Majesty, the person writing this letter is the Queen Regent Christina, who wants to betrothed to Queen Isabella II of Spain. This is very important to us in France. Before Gizet could finish speaking, Louis Philippe, who always liked to show off, lost his nerve and snatched the letter from Gizet's hand. Dear Sir Louis Philippe, I, Queen Regent Christina of Spain, on behalf of the Kingdom of Spain, hope that you can accept our marriage. This is for the friendship between Spain and France. for the future of both countries, and for Europe and the world a peace. We are obliged to do so, and look forward to hearing from you, Queen Regent of Spain, Maria Cristina. Louis Philippe could feel his heart burning. It had not felt like this for a long time. A decision he makes now is very likely to determine the fate of France and even Europe. Louis Philippe sympathized with Carlos in his heart, and Carlos must have made great determination to let his eldest son marry his daughter. This marriage was indeed beneficial to France. But this is nothing compared to the fact that Louis Philippe's son married the Queen of Spain. In fact, there was one person more surprised than Louis Philippe, and that was Thiers, whose jaw almost dropped to the ground. Thiers would never have imagined that within one day two contenders for the Spanish throne would offer an olive branch to France, and he understood the significance. And the Queen Regent's rule was even less stable than Carlos's. Once the Carolists are destroyed, it will not be difficult for France to bring down this stained Queen Regent. By that time, Louis Philippe could also serve as Regent of Spain, which would be wonderful for France. Thiers couldn't help but say, "God bless France, long live France." Guizot also said, "Long live France." Louis Philippe took a deep breath and calmed down his excitement. "Gentlemen, fire a salute." 101 shots. Thiers and Guizot looked at each other. This was not the right time to fire a salute. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I meant pop the champagne and let's celebrate." The attendant immediately brought champagne and filled the glasses for the three of them. "Long live France." The three wine glasses clinked together. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. To be honest, Franz was also surprised. He was surprised that the Queen Regent's shamelessness had exceeded his lower limit. He felt that, no matter how vicious a woman was, she would not use her own children as props. But he was wrong. At this time, Isabella II was less than 6 years old, and was directly sold as a bargaining chip by the Queen Regent. The Queen Regent of Spain is a woman who can do such a thing for her own power. She is really a character. Franz underestimated her before. In Franz's previous plan, he planned to have the Queen Regent ask the British for help. Although there were some deviations in the plan, the goal was achieved, and Britain and France would definitely intervene in the Spanish Civil War, because as long as the French intervene, Britain will have to intervene. Britain will not sit back and watch France and Spain unite. This will not only break the balance on the European continent, but also threaten the British homeland. The reason why Queen Regent Christina reacted so quickly was because Franz also wrote a letter to her in order to prevent the Spanish government forces from being caught off guard. When writing a letter to the Queen Regent, as long as you leave 30th, which says "I love you" on the signature, the Queen Regent will definitely receive it. After all, even the Queen Regent herself doesn't know how many lovers she has had, and her subordinates don't even know. They can't afford to delay the Queen Regent's good deeds. The Queen Regent was furious when she opened the letter, because it actually stated that Carlos had secretly contacted Louis Philippe and was willing to let his heir marry a princess of the Orleans family in exchange for French support. The Queen Regent's lover also saw this letter. The reason why he became the Queen Regent's lover was that he was handsome enough and he could accept the Queen Regent's hobbies. Therefore, the letters between the Queen Regent and her lovers, they all watched it together. Mont, the lover of the Queen Regent, was nothing more than a sergeant. He was so frightened that he almost peed when he heard that the French wanted to support Carlos. "Queen, my queen, let's surrender. The French are coming. One Frenchman can fight 10 Spaniards. We can't win." The Napoleonic Wars caused great disaster to Spain. According to legend, the French were more ferocious than man-eating devils. Queen Regent Christina slapped Mont down with a backhand, then squatted on the ground and held his face. "It's really a waste of your good skin." Mont saw the coldness in the Queen Regent's eyes, and his survival instinct prompted him to lick the Queen Regent's boots. The Queen Regent looked at Sergeant Mont with pity. "Don't worry, Carlos has a son, and I have a daughter." The fierce determination in his eyes made the air around him freeze, and Mont licked her boots harder. Chapter 59 Gossip. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Prince Metternich has a new mistress. Franz has long been used to Thalia's gossip, but this time Franz couldn't calm down. "Prince Metternich is 63 years old. Thalia, are you still unwilling to let him go?" "What? Do you mean I won't let him go? Then can you explain why a 63-year-old man is still keen on finding a new mistress?" Thalia retorted. Oh. How old is Prince Metternich's mistress? In fact, Franz was also a little curious. 20 years old, maybe less than 20 years old. How can a woman's age be exposed casually? This is an old cow eating young grass, but this is not surprising in aristocratic circles, right? Hey, Thalia said, pretending to be mysterious. There's something more explosive. What? Franz asked. Count Korolev also found the mistress. Thalia answered. I asked you to find out the news, but all you collected was gossip. Franz said helplessly. Don't worry, just listen to what I have to say, okay? Franz could only continue to listen patiently. Prince Metternich and Count Korolev's mistress are the same person. Thalia whispered. Aren't they sworn enemies? It seems that some of their views are quite consistent. My respected Grand Duke, perhaps you should expand your imagination. No, I just think that woman is seeking death. Metternich and Korolev are not easy to deal with. You know this. How can they not know it? Franz said with a smile. Thalia spread her hands. Anyway, this woman is now very popular in Vienna's upper class circles, and has even caused several duels. In fact, Austria is a very strange country. Duels are not allowed in the army of this country. Starting from Joseph II, as long as soldiers participated in duels in the army, they would be executed. But something weird happened. As long as duels were not fought in the army, it was not illegal. Nobles, civilians, and even Jews and gypsies had the right to duel. The duel culture in Austria is very serious, and even the most famous duel occurred between two women. That is, the shirtless fight between Metternich's granddaughter and the wife of the governor of Lower Austria. The swift sword was the Austrians' favorite weapon until the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A Vienna principal once said, a scholar should not die in a duel. His successors inherited this school motto well. Before World War II, fencing was a compulsory subject at the University of Vienna. Beauty is just a disaster. There is nothing to pay attention to. Talk about something else. Franz is not too cold about this kind of thing. People say she is the most beautiful woman in Vienna, a masterpiece of Venus. She looks like an angel, but has a pair of devil's eyes, which can enchant people. Franz stopped Thalia from continuing. Okay, don't you just want to see a beautiful woman? What's her name? If there's a chance, I'll ask my mother to take us there. Jenny. Thalia nodded with satisfaction. Any other news? Franz asked. The Polish Nationalist Army plans to establish a branch in Vienna. Thalia answered. Franz almost spit out the juice he just drank. What? This is Vienna. Yes, this is Vienna, but this was said publicly by a Polish nobleman in exile in a tavern, and now everyone in Vienna knows it. Ah, the Poles crazy? What do those secret police do? I don't know, but it seems that Count Korolev has not approved the budget of the secret police. It is said that Metternich's men can no longer afford to hire professional detectives, so they can only find some homeless people to replace them. Franz felt ashamed, forgetting that Count Korolev, a liberal, was very opposed to the secret police system. It seems that I can only rely on myself. The 20 people in my own guard seem not enough. Thalia, keep an eye on this matter. I think we can only solve this matter on our own. Yeah. Another thing happened recently, that is, the record of civilian killers has been refreshed again, reaching 670. Civilian killer? This was the first time Franz had heard of this name, and the number of 670 people was too exaggerated. You must know that the famous Jack the Ripper in history only killed 5 people on record. Oh, it's Dr. Thomas. He is the director of the Vienna General Hospital and an authority on obstetrics in Austria. The mortality rate of his deliveries is very low, but only among nobles. The civilian women he delivered had a narrow escape. He has been practicing medicine for 10 years. 670 civilians died at his hands. In Europe of this era, medicine was still very backward. Bloodletting for minor illnesses and amputation for serious illnesses was not a joke. At the best obstetrics and gynecology hospital in Europe at that time, the annual maternal mortality rate during childbirth was around 20%. This may not be intuitive, but the current mortality rate of pregnant women in China is 0.00000016. that time, the maternal mortality rate in Europe was 125,000 times that of China today, and the prerequisite was that it was in the best hospital in Europe. In most hospitals in Europe, it is common for the mortality rate to exceed 30%, and it is not surprising to even reach 40%. The Vienna General Hospital even created an exaggerated figure of zero maternal survival rate within 3 months. At that time, the mortality rate for Europeans giving birth at home was about 10%. He doesn't wash his hands. At that time, the mortality rate remained high, and one of the most important reasons was infection. At that time, there was no concept of clean surgery. No doctor would wash his hands before surgery. Moreover, they often performed another surgery just after completing one surgery. Some doctors even went to operate on patients right after going to the toilet. At that time, European doctors believed that water would weaken the function of human organs. Cold water would cause colds and diarrhea, while hot water would open pores and inhale more harmful bacteria, leading to serious diseases such as tuberculosis. In short, water is the source of all diseases. There are also religious factors at play. The church once canonized people who did not bathe for many years. Mr. Abraham was finally canonized as a saint because he insisted on not bathing for 50 years. This made it even more difficult for these doctors to not bathe or wash their hands. Reason. Failure. Then how do I know? Franz thought about it, but it was wrong to think about why the death rate of nobles was so low, while the death rate of commoners was so high. Talia, please print a few more copies of this 6-step hand washing method and give it to all hospitals in Vienna and ask them to follow it before surgery. Call it a royal decree. Thalia had developed the habit of washing her hands around Franz. After all, she would eat Franz's snacks with her hands when no one was watching. Franz didn't want to die of diarrhea for no reason. Okay, what's this going to do? Save people? Franz replied. Thalia picked up the 6 steps to hand washing that Franz had just written and prepared to make a few more copies. After all, according to Franz's personality, Vienna would be the first, and then the whole country. Wait. Franz stopped Thalia. You go in my carriage, you're going to die. Thalia made a motion of wiping her neck, then stuck out her tongue and rolled her eyes. Wouldn't it be nice if you had one less horse to tie up? Said Franz. I will write about the subsequent events in Spain in the evening. This chapter contains 3 foreshadowings regarding chapter 15 being swallowed. If the evening is not good, I will post it into the chapters. Chapter 60 Britain enters the game. London, England. The British Prime Minister, Viscount Melbourne, is planning the coronation of the famous Queen Victoria, who will be crowned in Westminster Abbey a year later. The Queen has just ascended the throne and the whole country is still in chaos. Palmerston took a letter, opened it, glanced at it twice, and then threw the letter heavily to the ground. These damn bastards should exile all French emperors to St. Helena Island. Viscount Melbourne glanced at Palmerston and smiled. Mr. Palmerston, please be happy when Her Majesty has just ascended the throne. Don't let the Queen think that we don't welcome her when she sees it. The British Empire is not afraid of any challenge. Let's put it aside beforehand. Palmerston handed the letter to Viscount Melbourne angrily. As soon as Viscount Melbourne opened the letter, his blood pressure soared, and he wanted to tear the letter into pieces immediately. Don't tear it up. Her Majesty the Queen hasn't read it yet, Palmerston reminded. Viscount Melbourne had no choice but to retract his hand angrily, but he really didn't expect that the Spanish would actually marry the French, and the object of the marriage would still be the young Her Majesty the Queen. We must never accept the emergence of such a behemoth in Europe. This is not in the interests of the British Empire. Viscount Melbourne said. That's natural. We have no choice, replied Palmerston. What's the Russian reaction? Viscount Melbourne asked. Tsar Nicholas I was very angry at first because it reminded him of the Napoleonic Empire that burned Moscow. But his advisors reminded him that the combination of France and Spain would leave us Britain with no time to look east, so that the Russian Empire could monopolize the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. The Oriental question, which competed for the Ottoman Empire's legacy, became the theme of European diplomacy in the 19th century. Turkey and its territories including the Balkan Peninsula Asia Minor, and North Africa are located on the route from the European continent to the Middle East and Asia, and their strategic position is extremely important. The Balkans and the Mediterranean region are rich in coal, iron, cotton and other resources, and are a favorable sales market and source of raw materials. Britain regarded the Ottoman Empire as the object of its expansion into the Middle East and the focus of competition with it are the other two focus areas that Britain and Russia competed for were Afghanistan and the Qing dynasty. The representative figure of the Russian threat theory is Lord Palmerston. Naturally, he will not let go of this opportunity to smear Russia, because he also wants to implement his anti-Russian plan around the world. Damn Russians. Viscount Melbourne did not comment too much on the Tsarist government, because he himself did not want to go to war with the Tsar. What about Austria's attitude? Austria. You know, their emperor, sort of, our ambassador doesn't think highly of him. As for the Regent Council, they don't care about international affairs at all, they only care about themselves. Palmerston replied, it's not like there's no reply at all. Palmerston's tone was a little awkward when he spoke. What did they say? Archduke Franz Carroll said he was going to attend the wedding of Isabella II and Prince Antoine. Really? Idiots. One is 6 years old and the other is 12 years old. Doesn't he have common sense? Viscount Melbourne said. Palmerston and the Viscount Melbourne were silent for a while. Then, they just sit back and watch the monster France and Spain emerge? Viscount Melbourne asked. At least from now on, there is no movement. Prime Minister, why don't you ask Prussia? Their opinions don't matter. Okay, Prime Minister. In fact, King William IV of Prussia sent a protest to France and Spain. Palmerston shrugged. But no one cares. Where's Carlos? Viscount Melbourne asked. Still hiding in the Pyrenees Mountains in northern Spain. After the death of General Siroma, the Carlist army was in disarray. At its peak, the Carlist army had 70,000 soldiers, but now it is probably less than 20,000. Palmerston answer. In this way, you send someone to contact Carlos and tell him that we are willing to fund him. But Spain must remain neutral and cannot ally with France, Spain, Pyrenees. Damn it. Damn it. I never proposed to Louis Philippe that my heir should marry the Princess of Orleans. Why don't you believe me? This is a conspiracy of the pseudo-queen. They are slandering me and trying to destroy me reputation. Carlos was roaring hysterically, but Carlos generals and staff fell silent. Some people can't help but wonder, is the throne of France not as important as your reputation? We would rather this be true. Now that Queen Regent Christina has joined forces with France, is there any hope for the Carolists? Damn it, the puppet queen is allied with Louis Philippe, and their purpose of writing this letter is to humiliate us. Really, right? Mirotto, the pseudo-queen refers to Queen Regent Christina. Raphael Mirotto was Carlos's most trusted general, but at this time he never broke off contact with the Queen Regent. But he did it very secretly, making Carlos think he was his strongest supporter historically. It was this Raphael Mirotto who killed the main generals of the Carlos faction and personally cut off Carlos' hope. Your Majesty, I know you have worked very hard. There is no need for you to hide this fact. I think that for your throne, all necessary means can be taken. Shut up, Mirotto. I tell you, I have never asked for a marriage to the Orleans family, and I will never let my son marry a woman from the Orleans family. They will only pollute the blood of my family. The Carolist generals had no choice but to look at each other. In fact, most of the generals hoped that Carlos would let his eldest son marry Louis Philippe's daughter, so that at least he could retain the hope of neutralizing the French point. But at this time, Carlos denied it, as if he was possessed, which really disappointed his generals, especially Mirotto, who had long planned to give up Carlos and surrender to Queen Regent Christina. It was only now that Carlos's supporters still accounted for the majority in the army, so he had to endure it. The general said, Your Majesty, the French have closed the border and refused to sell us food and medicine. If this continues, it won't be long before our supplies are exhausted, and we will be really finished by then. There is also news that the French are already gathering troops. They are preparing to cooperate with the puppet queen's army to completely trap us in the mountains. Another general said. In the 4 years since he started his army, Carlos had never shown any military talent, and this time was no exception. He just sat slumped in his chair at this time. The Spanish government forces had assembled 50,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, preparing to cooperate with the French to completely wipe out the remaining Carlist forces entrenched in the Pyrenees. In fact, the total strength of the Spanish government army has reached 250,000. However, due to tyranny and natural disasters over the years, uprisings have continued throughout Spain. Sufficient local forces must be retained to suppress uprisings that occur from time to time. This time, Queen Regent Christiana sent her most trusted generals and most powerful troops, hoping to cooperate with the French to completely eliminate the threat of Collis. However, the French commander in charge of this operation, Lieutenant General Pierre, received orders to cooperate with the Spanish in fighting. Thanks to Xiao 201708032323071184. Book Friends 160,805,111,027,083. Book Friends 201801151549522244. Fugiven. Book Friends 151,128,153,614,033. Blue Lantern Long Burning. Death Honor. Book Friends 201,832,032,041,918's monthly votes, and the support of the Viewer's Essence Chapter 61. All Quiet in the North. June 20th, 1836. Isabella II was officially engaged to Louis Philippe's youngest son, Antoine, and they were to be married when Isabella was 16. The marriage of Isabella II meant that she could personally control the power of the court, so the position of Queen Regent was no longer needed. Although Queen Regent Christian wanted to keep her position, she had no choice but to compromise due to strong pressure from France. The Northern Legion's anti-bandit work was very successful, but this legion was not the strongest legion sent by Queen Regent Christiana. During the early years of the Carlist War, the Queen Regent organized several larger regiments. However, the quality of soldiers and officers is very low. Most of the officers rely on bribery and suppression of civilians to rise to power. Their command can be described as incompetent. The soldiers are just bandits who legally rob. They burn, kill, and loot without committing any evil. For scorched earth. This allowed the mountain people and guerrillas to unite as one and use their familiarity with the terrain to repeatedly defeat more with less. On the contrary, when the government army is fighting smoothly, it is fine. Once it falls into a passive position, internal conflicts immediately break out. There are many internal conflicts, fights, desperate attempts, and even betraying the intelligence of one's own comrades in order to attack the opponent and stabilize oneself in the government army status. The Carlist guerrillas, under the command of General Sirima, once pushed the front to Bilbao. However, due to Collis's indiscriminate command, General Sirima was killed in battle. At the same time, the Queen Regent's government forces finally emerged with outstanding generals such as Espartero and Count Sabir. Espartero was born a commoner. His father was a carriage repairman. Espartero participated in the anti-Napoleonic War at the age of 15. He performed bravely in the war and was promoted to captain. After the Napoleonic Wars, he went to fight in the Spanish colonies. His experience in South America made Espartero very familiar with guerrilla warfare. After returning home, Espartero joined the government army, repelled guerrilla attacks many times, and successfully ambushed the Carlist leader General Sirima during the Battle of Bilbao, causing the latter to be seriously injured and died. Espartero was promoted to general based on his merits in this battle. And now Espartero has been exceptionally promoted by the Queen Regent to Commander-in-Chief of the Northern Army, responsible for cooperating with the French army to completely eliminate the remaining Carlist forces entrenched in the Pyrenees. Espartero was an excellent general. He had already figured out the details of the Carlists before taking action and made detailed arrangements. The Carlist army claims to have 20,000 soldiers, but most of them are untrained farmers and herdsmen. At the same time, there are a large number of speculators and bandits among the Carlist faction who can be bought with money. And Carlos himself is an idiot. If it weren't for his lack of talent and his tendency to give random orders, Siroma would definitely be the biggest challenge he faced. Fortunately, Carlos personally buried this general who was good at fighting. Most of the current Carolist generals have never attended a military academy. They only focus on the gains and losses of one city and one place, and have no overall view of the overall situation. The Northern Army led by Aspartero achieved great success in the early stages of the war, and defeated the Carolists. On the other hand, the French Foreign Legion led by Lieutenant General Pierre also attacked very smoothly and successively captured several important Carolist strongholds. However, a huge problem arose now. Espartero received an order from the Queen Regent to stay put and preserve his strength. Lieutenant General Pierre seemed to have a tacit understanding with him and also stopped his advance. Louis Philippe also did not want the French army to suffer losses, and he did not trust the Queen Regent herself, so he needed to weaken the Queen Regent as much as possible and preserve the combat power of the French army. As a result, the two sides began a sit-down competition, but the two leading generals also felt that this was an appropriate point. Then the two sides informed each other of their difficulties, hoping that the other party could advance troops in advance, and promised that, as long as the other party advanced troops, they would follow. Espartero, although Her Majesty the Queen Regent's government army has 62,000 people, the cavalry in the mountains cannot be used. At the same time, they also brought 100 cannons, and most of these cannons were old and heavy, which seriously slowed down our march. I had to have my men fix it. Lieutenant General Pierre His Majesty the King sent a foreign corps. They have no experience in mountain warfare. Moreover, we still need to cut off the supply lines of the Carolists. We really do not have enough troops to continue advancing. In fact, both sides understood that, whether it was from the direction of Spain or France, the supply lines were cut off, and Carlos was already a turtle in the urn. As long as they spend 2 months here, Carlos's army will cease to exist, and those soldiers will become helpless peasants and poor beggars. However, they did not wait for Carlos's trapped beast to fight, which made the two generals who were good at fighting feel a little uneasy. Their hunch was correct, and the British found Carlos. His Majesty, you call me your Majesty? Don't you British want to persuade me to give up the throne and always call me sir? You also want to give me a pension and let me retire in the UK. Carlos was at the end of his rope at this time. His territory was compressed in the mountains. There were not many supplies left, and several companies had already left without saying goodbye. The general loyal to Carlos proposed a counterattack to boost morale, but Carlos did not have the courage to fight to the death. He hoped to hide in the mountains as before and wait for the opponent's supplies to run out and retreat. It's just that this time Carlos's supply line was cut off by the French, and the Spanish government forces had allocated a large amount of supplies in advance, so the initiative was not on his side. The arrival of the British can be said to be a life-saving straw, but Carlos, who was in anger, did not seem to notice this liaison officer. Baron Peter was also very depressed. If there wasn't an order from above to reach an agreement with Carlos, he really wanted to leave immediately and ignore this idiot, but at this time he could only speak patiently. At the beginning, it was just a test for you. If you are now willing to accept the conditions and go to the UK, we are now willing to provide you with a pension of 30,000 yuan per year. But now we have senior ambitions, and our British Empire is willing to fully support you. Carlos was still not satisfied. He wanted to say something more, but was blocked by the staff and generals around him. Baron Pitt continued, it is said that as far as we know, there are 70,000 troops of the Queen Regent of France and Spain outside the mountain, but you have less than 20,000 troops, and they are seriously short of supplies. For your safety, I propose that you take our ship to Portugal, where we will train your army for you. That's impossible. Carlos replied decisively, I'm here, this is my home, and I want to live and die with my soldiers. With all due respect, your army may be vulnerable, but you insist on doing so, and we are willing to provide you with supplies, mercenaries, and an experienced commander. Before Baron Peter could finish speaking, he was interrupted by Carlos. What are your intentions? Carlos didn't believe that there was such a good thing. The other party must have an intention. Baron Peter directly stated his purpose. We hope that you will refuse to marry the French and promise never to ally with the French. York, User Point. A young man dressed as a gentleman said a few words to the teller. With just a few words, the teller became panicked. He asked the young gentleman to wait, and then quickly ran to the lobby manager's office. A butterfly in the Amazon rainforest of South America can cause a tornado in Texas 2 weeks later by flapping its wings occasionally. A withdrawal on June 28, 1836 would trigger a global economic crisis a few months later. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 62 Butterfly. Headquarters of the Bank of New York, User Point. Casico has the right to be proud. After all, he is the lobby manager of the Bank of New York, the second largest bank in the United States. Today he was smoking a cigar as usual, sitting in his office, and looking at the latest prices of land in the United States. Suddenly a young man stumbled in, and before the young man could speak, Casico spoke first. Look at what you look like, Jim. We are the second largest bank in the United States. Being in such a panic will make those high-end customers think that we are unreliable. Remember, no matter what happens, be graceful, Mr. Casico. There is a gentleman outside asking for $2 million in gold. What? Gold? Casico exclaimed. Yes, he only wants gold, not banknotes. Young Jim seemed to already know what Casico was going to ask, and said first, oh my god, 2 million gold, damn it. Casico slapped his face hard to calm himself down. Casico understood the seriousness of the matter. $2 million was almost all of his reserves. Even the largest bank in the United States could not afford to pay $2 million in gold at a time. This is most likely not a simple redemption, but a run on a rival bank. After all, the US banking community knows the fact that the number of US dollar banknotes has far exceeded the upper limit of what US banks can redeem. Casico, I thought so in my heart. Arriving at the VIP room, Casico saw the young gentleman. The young man had a finely chiseled face, and with his bowler hat and tailcoat, Casico could be sure that the person in front of him must be a British nobleman. Damn British guy. Casico cursed secretly in his heart, but he still put on a smiling face. Hello, sir. How may I help you? Hello, my name is Lemon Wayne. The young man took off his hat and saluted. I have deposited some money in your bank. Now I'm leaving the United States and want to exchange it into gold and send it back to the country. The US dollar exchange rate at this time was not stable, and different countries had different exchange rates at different times. Moreover, the US dollar is not a world currency. The only world currencies at this time are silver and gold. Mr. Wayne, look at this. I can provide you with a special interest rate. Your money will be deposited in our bank first, and after 1 year we will send it to your home with interest. What do you think? Casico then told Jim. Jim, bring the deposit slip. Let Mr. Wayne see it, and then write down Mr. Wayne's address. Imin. Wayne raised his hand to signal Jim to stop. He was the nephew of Baron Brooke, and the purpose of his visit was to run the bank in a low-key manner. Naturally, he would not agree to Casico's suggestion. Sir, I need my gold now. Casico understood that the other party had bad intentions, but he could neither pay immediately nor lose the face of the Bank of New York. After all, if the other party yelled in the lobby, it would most likely cause panic and make the Bank of New York lose its face. Well, I understand how you feel, but the amount of money you have is relatively large. I need to apply to my superiors to allocate a batch of gold for you. How about you just live here for a while? As for the cost of accommodation, it is all paid by our bank. Will bear it. Yemin Wayne nodded. After all, he had to keep a low profile. Anyway, the effect of running on the bank was achieved. He is happy to spend a few more days in New York. After all, the prices here are so cheap. The price of meat is only half of that in Austria. The price of tobacco is 1/3 of that in Austria, and the price of sugar is even ridiculously low. After all, the money was paid by Americans, so it doesn't count as corruption on his part, so why not do it? Spain, Pyrenees, Carlos Army Camp, Your Majesty Carlos, please allow me to introduce to you, this is Mr. John George Woodford. He will serve as the commander-in-chief of your troops and help you tide over the difficulties. In addition, we have also prepared for you at the northern port enough food, weapons, and clothing. John George Woodford, a former British Army Lieutenant General, accompanied the Iron Duke Wellington to enter the border and wipe out the Spanish ministers. However, unlike his brother who was good at business, John George Woodford did not like those politicians and always criticized those politicians for harming the country. Therefore, he was forced to retire early many years ago and take care of himself at home. Baron Pitt introduced Carlos's special military advisor, Sir John George Woodford, since Britain still needs the French to help them check and balance the Russians in the Far East. It does not want to have too much trouble with the French, and Britain will never allow a monster united by France and Spain to be born on the European continent. However, given that the French only sent 10,000 troops, the British decided to use this veteran who had retired for many years and gave him some mercenaries to lead Carlos to continue fighting guerrillas in northern Spain. Viscount Melbourne and Palmerston agreed that the French had fallen once in Spain and it would not be surprising to fall again. John George Woodford and Lieutenant General Peer were old acquaintances, having both fought in the Napoleonic Wars when the Duke of Wellington led his army to defeat the French army in Spain. The two of them were opponents unexpectedly. Decades later, they would become rivals again, and the stage was still in Spain. It must be said that it was a wonderful fate. John George Woodford was a battle-hardened veteran. He understood that the enemies outside were waiting for their opportunity. Waiting for the Carlos army. Supplies were exhausted, and the time came to make a desperate move. But now, with the support of the UK, they may be disappointed. John George Woodford understood that the greater threat than supplies and powerful enemy forces was the traitors of the Carlos army. Therefore, John George Woodford's first order was to move the troops further north to avoid fighting, while leaving a small force behind to ambush the traitors who were delivering intelligence to the Spanish government forces and the French. The Carolist generals were very happy to have an experienced general in command. After all, this is definitely more reliable than Carlos' personal command. Although Carlos was very unhappy with the British commanding his troops, he had nothing to do. After all, he knew nothing about combat and needed weapons and supplies from the British. Vienna, General Medical Hospital. Dr. Thomas tore Franz's 6 hand-washing methods into pieces and roared, "This is simply an insult to the medical profession. The idiotic decree signed by that idiot emperor cannot even come into effect here. Vienna, Hall of Mirrors, my stupid brother, don't you have anything to do? You actually care whether others wash their hands or not? My poor brother, don't you think it's disgusting that those doctors come to treat you just after going to the toilet? I even suspect that they put something unclean into your body, which made you become it looks like this now." Ferdinand I was convinced and immediately signed a royal decree requiring doctors to wash their hands before treating people. There were a lot of typists just now, so I'll correct them. Chapter 63 Battle of San Jacinto, April 21st, 1836. San Jacinto, Texas, United States. Historically, in San Jacinto, the Texan army led by the American settler businessman Sam Houston defeated the Mexican army of Tazanana in just 18 minutes. In this battle, Sam Houston used 800 troops to raid 3,000 Mexican troops, causing the Mexican army to lose more than 700 people. Only 11 of his own troops were killed. It can be called the Zioyojin of North America, but Zhang Babei and Sun Quan were replaced by Sam Houston and Tazanana. Perhaps it was a coincidence of history that after the Battle of the Alamo, Tazanana completely wiped out the remaining Texan forces around San Antonio, and then decided to head north. This day happened to be April 21st, 1836. Tazanana received reinforcement from Mexico, and the total strength has reached 12,000, but 4,000 troops need to be left to garrison San Antonio to prevent their retreat from being cut off. A Comanche tribe was bribed by the Americans, and Tazanana sent an army of 2,000 men to teach them an unforgettable lesson. At the same time, according to intelligence, an American team was besieging Fort Marion. As long as you are an officer, you can tell that this is definitely a plan by the Americans to divert the tiger away from the mountain. Both Gab Lenz and Stadion felt that they should abandon Fortress Marion and go directly north to besiege Austin Point in this way. Regardless of whether the Americans were really fighting or pretending to fight, they would have to return to aid Austin Point, because once Austin falls, the Americans' retreat will be completely cut off, and only one fortress, Dallas, will be left in the North Point. In this way, the initiative in the war rests with Mexico. When the time comes, it will not be up to the Americans whether to encircle the point for reinforcement or to increase troops for siege point. After listening to the suggestions of the two generals, Tazanana decided to send the main force to Merion to relieve the siege, while he led his troops to find a place to camp. First point one is that the weather is too hot, and the other is that Archduke Franz Karol suggested that we should stay strong and fight stupidly. Point Franz was not in Mexico, and his understanding of military affairs may not be very deep, but he only knew this period of history, and he firmly believed that the raid was a conspiracy. Point in fact, it was the Mexicans who betrayed Tazanana. There were many factions in Mexico. Some people were dissatisfied with Tazanana, so they revealed Tazanana's combat plan to Sam Houston, and used a false intelligence to lure him. Take away Tazanana's 3,000 main force. Point at this time, Tazanana only had 2,500 Mexican soldiers, 200 temporarily recruited Texans, and 300 black soldiers. Tazanana followed Franz's suggestion and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but he still hated black slaves. The 300 black soldiers were only allocated 150 guns and some cold weapons, but the black soldiers did not complain and still worshipped Tazanana as a savior. Sam Houston led 800 Texans to ambush Tazanana's camp. He was waiting for a signal. The person who sold him the intelligence promised to burn the bridge to cut off Tazanana's retreat. Mr. Houston, are we going to die? Jimmy, the recruit, asked. Point Jimmy was a young Texas volunteer. He was originally a horse wrangler. One day, several fellow Americans came to his farm and said that the Mexicans would snatch away all his horses and confiscate his horses. Jimmy was very angry and joined the Texas Army with a gun despite his mother's obstruction. Point Jimmy had killed people, and there had been some Indians who were always wandering near his family's ranch and claimed that his family's land belonged to the Indians. So Jimmy's father hired some cowboys to exterminate the Indian tribe. Point Jimmy was also present when he saw an old Indian man and planned to jump into the river to escape. He pulled the trigger. The old man fell by the river. Jimmy's hunting dog excitedly rushed forward to bite the prey. Point Jimmy's father saw Jimmy knocking down an Indian with a gun and excitedly handed Jimmy a knife. Jimmy, scalp him like a man with this. Jimmy took his father's knife and grabbed the Indian's hair. Jimmy's father used Jimmy's trophies to make a pair of boots for him and gave them to Jimmy as a birthday present. Point but Jimmy, who was on the battlefield for the first time, still couldn't stop shaking his hands. Houston looked at the recruit in front of him who had yet to grow a full beard, smiled, and kissed the child's forehead. All men are destined to die, but it will not be us who die today. Don't worry, my child, God is with us. Are the ancestors of Mexicans all criminals and Indians? Mr. Houston, Jimmy asked. No, but Mexico does have a lot of mestizos. Where are those black slaves? Jimmy pointed to the black troops at the edge of the camp. They were our property, taken away from us by Mexico's shameless dictator, and we, Texans, fought to protect our property and our freedom. Suddenly, a fire broke out on the bridge, and there was a commotion in Tazanana's military camp. The soldiers were at a loss. Some were putting out the fire, while others were running around aimlessly. Point Tazanana was making out with his mistress, Miss Jenny, in his tent at this time. After serving in the Mexican army for many years, he had long been accustomed to this kind of messy situation, so he just yelled at the adjutant outside, "Cama, go see what's going on. Tell them to shut up, gablans." And Stadion tried to stop the chaos, but their Spanish was poor and the Mexican soldiers were completely disobedient. At this moment they saw Cama. "General Cama, you are here just in time. Let them stop and put out the fire. Otherwise, the bridge will be burned, and it will be difficult for the army to supply." Cama nodded, understanding the importance of this bridge, and drew his pistol. Bang, bang, stop it. Before Cama could finish his words, he heard a gunshot and a bullet hit Cama. Point Cama covered his chest in disbelief, and the surrounding soldiers looked at each other. At this moment, more bullets were fired, and several Mexican soldiers who were still in place were knocked down. A shell exploded in the air, and the scattered projectiles caused a bloody storm in the camp. The fallen soldiers smashed the campfire and soon ignited the surrounding tents, making the Mexican army even more chaotic. Houston seized the opportunity, knowing that this battle would go down in history. For freedom. For our land. Charge. Houston's Texan army was overwhelming and quickly broke through the Mexican army's defense line. They were less than 200 meters away from Tazanana's tent point. While the Mexican army was fleeing, a group of black soldiers blocked Houston's Texan army with their flesh and blood. Most of these black soldiers were liberated slaves. They had only received simple training, and many of them even shot their rifles randomly, as if they were magic. However, these black soldiers resisted the Texan attack with amazing courage. Houston knew the opportunity to end the war was at hand, and he had to do whatever it took. Brothers, Tazanana is right in front. Rush with me. The black slaves on the opposite side kept roaring and rushed towards the Texan army. The black soldiers launched a desperate charge, slowing down the Texans and buying time for Gablens and Stadion to regroup. Facing the Mexican army that began to counterattack, Houston had no choice but to retreat. At this time, a person hugged his thigh. It was Jimmy. His foot was injured. Mr. Houston, please help me. Houston looked at Jimmy, who was lying on the ground, and then at the surrounding Mexican troops. He hit Jimmy in the face with the butt of his rifle and fled with his troops. Historically, Houston captured Tazanana at the cost of 11 men, thus ending the Battle of Texas and establishing the United States' century-old psychological advantage over Mexico. However, 300 black soldiers changed history with their lives. The Texas army lost less than 200 people in this battle, causing nearly 1,000 casualties of the Mexican army and burning countless Mexican baggage. The black soldiers paid a huge price. Only 23 people from the 3 companies survived. Chapter 64 Murderer. Tazanana walked out of his tent. He looked at the fallen soldiers and the burning camp and buttoned his jacket. Tazanana decided to visit his military camp, and Miss Jenny joined the rescue team as a nurse. Before this battle, Tazanana might have only been intoxicated with the feeling of being a savior and being worshipped. So now, he began to really think about these soldiers who were fighting to save him. Tazanana, as a president, does not understand politics. As a general, he does not know how to fight, and as a man, he cannot control his body, let alone his wife. But Tazanana was always good to his men. He cared about his soldiers and would allow them to plunder whenever they had the chance and keep their spoils. He even made his orderly the vice president. Those who benefited from him usually called him president, general, Napoleon of North America, and savior. However, at the critical moment, all those people fled and ignored him. The 3,000-man military formation was almost pierced by 800 people. If it weren't for those 300 black soldiers, I'm afraid Tazanana would have gone to see God or be locked up in a cell at Houston Barracks. Most of the black soldiers on the ground fell on the charging road, and many of them still had sabers and pitchforks in their hands. A black soldier was dead, but his hands were still clutching a Texan's neck. Tazanana took the battle damage statistics sent by the orderly and took off his hat to pay tribute to these brave men. Tazanana ordered these warriors to be buried lavishly, and all 23 surviving black soldiers were promoted to sergeants. One of the black soldiers even captured 2 prisoners and was directly promoted to major, allowing him to command the black battalion. In the Mexican army, the official rank of major is not low, and it is definitely an exceptional promotion. At this time, the total military strength in Mexico was only 27,000, and a colonel often managed 1,000 to 1,500 people. There were only about 20 colonels with real power in the country. Although Tazanana is the president now, he prefers others to call him a general because he was a general in the past. In the Mexican army, general is the highest military rank, and there are only 4 people in the country who hold this title. In order to commend the black soldier for his bravery, Tazanana decided to give him a Spanish name, Diego, which means brave warrior. Tazanana asked Diego, "What do you want?" "Bullet, sir." Tazanana pulled off Diego's bullet bag and found that it contained stones. "Quartermaster," roared Tazanana. The quartermaster trotted over, and Tazanana threw the bullet bag to the quartermaster. "How is this going? The quartermaster looked at the stones in the bag and showed an embarrassed expression. Maybe. I got it wrong, Tazan. Anna took out his single-shot pistol and pointed it at the quartermaster's forehead. You got it by mistake. My soldiers have no bullets or rifles. They fight with people with machetes and spears. You say you got it by mistake. The quartermaster knelt on the ground and prayed. This is just a joke. Please let me go, Mr. President. Many people knew that the quartermaster gave stones to black soldiers as ammunition, and everyone praised his humor at the time. A joke. Just because of your joke, I lost my best soldier. Have you thought about how you died? At this time, the quartermaster realized the seriousness of the problem. The person in front of him was not only the president of Mexico, but also a murderous warlord and bandit leader. Let me go. For God's sake, let you go? How can I explain to those dead soldiers? My brother-in-law is General Gabriel, and he is your ally. Gabriel? Skin him and send it to Gabriel when you return home, so that he can recognize it. 2 indigenous soldiers, one on the left and one on the right, lifted up the quartermaster and walked towards the open space in the middle of the military camp. Let me go. President General Tazanana ignored the damn quartermaster, but instead invited Gab Lenz and Stadion to watch the execution with great interest. Point in front of the quartermaster's body, Tazanana announced, anyone who fights for Mexico is a citizen of Mexico. Point any Mexican soldier is a soldier of my Tazanana. Point all citizens and all soldiers enjoy the same treatment. Point no one can look down on you. If there is, then I, Tazanana, will be the first to not let him go. Tazanana enjoys the attention of everyone. He likes the feeling of being a hero. Point in this battle, Tazanana lost half of his supplies, and he had to retreat to San Antonio. Point in fact, he still has about 10,000 rifles in his hand, which were obsolete products purchased from Austria at that time. However, he always has a miser mentality. He does not want to issue these guns to soldiers, and now he has to do so. While back in San Antonio to recuperate, Tazanana made good on his promise. Point he liberated all the black slaves in San Antonio and gave them some plantations abandoned by the Texans, giving them the guarantee of a decent life. Point. But Tazanana demanded that these black families must fight for him, and each family must send one member to join his army. Point a new black infantry battalion was formed, and its first battalion commander was Diego. Point all black men were given military uniforms, a flintlock musket and 20 rounds of ammunition. Point Tazanana's troops will move north again in a month. Point Vienna. Point the medical association, represented by Dr. Thomas, protested to Emperor Ferdinand I. They believed that doctors' hands were sacred, and it was rude to ask doctors to wash their hands. If the emperor insisted on his rude request, all doctors in Vienna would go on strike. Point Count Korolaf and Prince Metternich were both curious as to why the two brothers, His Majesty the Emperor and Archduke Franz Karol, were having trouble with a group of doctors for the first time. The Regency Council consulted the Emperor. Those disgusting guys want to put their disgusting things on me. I'm the Emperor, and I say this is not allowed. Ferdinand I roared. Point Count Korolaf and Metternich looked at each other, thinking that it was probably some doctor who had put something dirty on the Emperor's body that made the Emperor so angry. Point they decided to first arrest the doctor who had recently treated the Emperor and calm down the Emperor's anger. If Parliament makes a decision, even if the Queen's death sentence is sent to her, she will have to sign it. But such a thing was absolutely impossible in Austria at this time. The first thing the Regency Council thought of was to appease the Emperor's anger with the issuance of the arrest warrant. The previously heated doctor strike disappeared instantly. Point even Dr. Thomas returned to his job, shouting "Long live Ferdinand I" every day when he saw people, for fear of being arrested by the secret police. Point Franz also specially collected a lot of evidence for this purpose. He was going to have a debate with all the doctors in Vienna, and even invited the church to stand up. Point of course, he was also prepared to be regarded as a madman. After all, the first doctor in history who proposed the hand-washing method was beaten to death by his colleagues as a madman. Point however, as the investigation deepened, Franz became increasingly angry. He felt that the civilian killer must die. Point according to the testimony of Dr. Thomas's assistant, Dr. Thomas would wash his hands with wine before treating nobles every time, but he would not treat common people. Point this is not medical malpractice, this is murder. Thank you to book friends. Dust of Fire. Book friends. 201708032323071184. Boo Boo Buka. Book friends 201811072312388042. Unparalleled Heroes. Punacho. Book friends 201702180051515275. How can you be biased when you are far away? Saint Ladislaus. Memories of Lost Time, Zero Salted Fish, and other monthly tickets that consume more youth. As well as the support of all readers. Chapter 65, The Demon-Possessed Doctor. Vienna. General Medical Hospital. Point Doctor Thomas is packing his bags. He hates this evil country. He is young, rich, and speaks French. He can go to Paris to find a better job. Point Thomas is a doctor, the greatest profession in this era besides banker. Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas. That idiot Archduke wants to challenge you. This is the challenge just sent by the postman. Will you accept it? Thomas' assistant shouted excitedly. Which idiot Archduke? That is the Emperor's younger brother, Archduke Franz Karl. Drive. Thomas asked doubtfully. That idiot wants to challenge me. What's so exciting about that? I'm a doctor. How can I duel with an idiot? The assistant explained. Oh, no, Dr. Thomas, it's not a duel. He wants to debate you, and it's scheduled to be in the Central Park Square in Vienna this weekend. Drive. Thomas was stunned for a moment, and then burst into laughter. Interesting. I accept this challenge. I want to discredit the Habsburg family. Soon, the news that Dr. Thomas was going to debate Archduke Franz Karl in Vienna's Central Park spread throughout Vienna, and some people even rushed to Vienna from other places overnight, just to witness this bizarre debate. Point this matter is being discussed in pubs and coffee shops. Did you hear that? That idiot Archduke is going to have a debate with a real social elite. You said that the Grand Duke planned to use this method to persuade doctors to abide by the new laws issued by the Emperor. What? New law? Why haven't I heard of it? It has nothing to do with ordinary people like us. It's just a requirement that doctors must wash their hands before treating patients. It's just a matter of washing their hands, and it's not asking them to pay taxes. Are those doctors going to disobey the Emperor's order because of this? Isn't that right? They always feel that they are very noble. Noble people don't need to wash their hands. How? Noble? More noble than the royal family. It is said that Dr. Thomas, who had united many doctors to openly oppose the Emperor's decree, is going on strike. Why didn't I hear about it? Do you think those doctors are stupid? There are many supporters, but by the time they take to the streets, there are not many. It is said that this incident has angered the Emperor, and the secret police has begun arresting people. At this time, someone at the next table interrupted. The news I heard is different from what you heard. I heard that when a doctor treated the Emperor, he didn't wash his hands and rubbed feces all over the Emperor. The Emperor was very angry, so he asked the doctor to wash his hands before seeing a doctor. Well, what a pervert. No wonder the Emperor is angry. Stop talking. Let's go take a look. After all, there are not many opportunities to watch the royal family debate with others. What's there to see? This Archduke Franz Karl has a bad brain. Last time I went to my store to buy a fish tank, I picked the biggest one, but the carriage couldn't fit in it. I wanted to change him to a smaller one, but the Grand Duke smashed the big fish tank and loaded it into the carriage. Haha. Dr. Thomas is the leader of the medical community in Vienna. Now it's even more interesting. After all, the opportunity to humiliate and ridicule the royal family does not come every day. Everyone wants to see how this idiot Archduke humiliates himself. On Sunday, the Central Park Square in Vienna was crowded with people. Everyone wanted to have a glimpse of the idiot Archduke. Dr. Thomas had arrived at the square in advance and invited a lot of Viennese medical experts. He didn't want his performance to be without an audience. Besides, he felt that with so many experts there, someone would always be able to figure out a way to deal with the Archduke. After an hour-long wait, one or two royal carriages slowly separated the crowd. Archduke Franz Karl jumped out of the carriage. He could smell the alcohol on the Archduke's body some distance away, and thought to himself that he was really worrying too much. Grand Duke, are you ready? Okay. Hiccup. It is well known that from Hippocrates to the present, doctors can only be held by noble people. Water is the source of all diseases. Water will weaken the function of human organs. Cold water will cause colds and diarrhea, and hot water will cause pores open, thereby inhaling more harmful germs, leading to serious diseases such as tuberculosis. Thomas kept talking about the rules that doctors of this era had regarded as golden rules. Archduke Franz Karol obviously didn't listen, and interrupted him directly. Let me ask you a few questions. I ask, you answer. Thomas was unhappy, but the gap in status made it hard for him to be tough. You say, do you wash your hands before you operate on me? No, the doctor's hands are noble and holy. Drive. Thomas tried to resonate so that he could get rid of the big guy as soon as possible. Do you wash your hands after surgery? Yes. After all, it's uncomfortable to be sticky. Then why didn't you wash your hands before surgery? Because there is nothing on it. What are you referring to? Blood, internal organs, in short, those things in the human body. Oh, then you have to wash your hands after touching people. Why don't you wash your hands after touching other things? I do. You think the members of the Habsburg family are worse than the papyrus you used? I don't. Then why did you disobey my brother's decree? They call you a civilian killer. This is because. But before Dr. Thomas could explain clearly, Archduke Franz Karol continued to ask, why did you murder the people of the Austrian Empire? I didn't. That's my duty. I'm just a doctor. I'm just treating illnesses and saving people. At this time, Thalia walked onto the podium with Thomas' assistant and 2 thick notebooks. There are 2 notebooks here. One records Dr. Thomas's medical practice records in the past 10 years, and the other is Dr. Thomas's observation diary. Thalia opened Dr. Thomas's medical records first. It is clearly recorded here that Dr. Thomas has a habit of washing his hands with strong alcohol before treating nobles. His success rate in treating nobles is very high, which is why he can become the president of the medical association. Thalia immediately changed the subject, but according to his assistant's records, Dr. Thomas would never wash his hands with strong alcohol when treating civilians. Instead, he would deliberately smear strange things on his fingers, such as cow dung and ginkgo tree sap. There are notes on this, and Dr. Thomas's assistant as witness. Thalia picked up another notebook. Dr. Thomas was excited and wanted to snatch it, but was punched down by Archduke Franz Karol. This is Dr. Thomas's diary. It records in detail the symptoms and comments of infected patients before their death. Dr. Thomas enjoys recording the pain of these infected patients before their death. He is a murderer. Everyone was in an uproar. That highly respected Dr. Thomas actually has this habit. That's not necessarily true. There's no such thing as a guy with a human face and a beast's heart. Maybe he's possessed by a demon. Vienna's police chief, von Sirigi, arrested Dr. Thomas on the spot. As for the charges, of course, he was in contempt of the royal family and suspected of more than 600 murders, as well as being possessed by an evil spirit. Quiet. Quiet. This Dr. Thomas blatantly disobeys the emperor's order and just wants to continue his evil research. Before finding out whether this demon-possessed villain has any accomplices, all doctors must persist hand-wishing. Just as the police chief finished speaking, Archbishop Prussia also appeared on the stage. The church has received a revelation that to purify evil, we must rely on the power of God. We have discovered a sacred substance that can purify evil. I call it divine radiance. It can purify evil by simply placing it in water. It sells for 5 francs per ounce. Ralin. In fact, what Prussia calls divine radiance is calcium hypochlorite, which is bleaching powder. Bleach powder can not only sterilize and disinfect, but it is also very cheap. It is of high quality and low price point. Bleaching powder could be synthesized as early as 1789, but people in this era could only use bleaching powder to bleach clothes. Its main function in modern times is sterilization and disinfection, which is not widely known. Cholera, dysentery, and malaria were common occurrences in this era, and many important people died from such minor illnesses before Pasteur founded the germ theory. It can be said that the Western world was in this state of 5 guarantee households. There was no family planning in this era, but the slow population growth is the best evidence. Franz did not intend to let the murderer go, let alone give him a chance to explain, but in order to convince the people and increase his influence, he could only use this despicable method. The result was that Thomas would be prosecuted for the murder of 670 subjects of the Austrian Empire, and his body would be taxidermied for future medical students to study. Chapter 66 Selling Water to Save People. Vienna. Public cemetery. An unnamed tombstone is carved with a portrait of the Virgin Mary. This tombstone is dedicated to the women and children who died in childbirth. Franz placed a bouquet of flowers on the unmarked tombstone. That's all I can do. I hope the tragedy won't continue. Franz left in the royal carriage, and Austria's maternal mortality rate continued to decline, finally falling to 1% a year later. Street. Stephen's Cathedral. In a special small room, the 13 most powerful bishops of the Austrian Catholic Church gathered together. Light spilled through the stained glass at the top, making it difficult to see the faces of the bishops. I thought our days of selling holy water and indulgences were over. As long as you can help people, why bother with these false names? Can these powders and alcohol really save people's lives? You won't know until you try it, but the benefits are real. Agree. Sometimes, in order to spread science, we have to use some unscientific methods. Mexico, Texas, May 10, 1836. After a period of repair, Tazinana once again gathered his forces and marched towards Austin. This time, what stood in front of Tazinana was the El Paso Legion. Although the self-proclaimed legion actually consisted of less than 1,000 Texans, 500 American volunteers, and 300 mercenaries. Military. Before the Alamo and San Jacinto, Texas and Mexico claimed victory. Mexico publicized that it had captured US Congressman Crockett at the Alamo, forcing the Alamo garrison to surrender, and out of humanitarian spirit made them confess and repent of their sins, and then released those people. Crockett escaped all the way back to Tennessee, and closed his doors to all visitors, while the other captives were nowhere to be found. The United States claimed that the Texans held off the Mexican army for 16 days, using less than 1/40 of the Mexican troops, and killed Mexican troops several times their own. At the Battle of San Jacinto, the Americans even claimed that the Texans had wiped out Tazinana's main force. Tazinana himself had to cross the river to escape, abandoning countless weapons and baggage. The Mexicans claimed that they had annihilated a Texas cavalry brigade, and found evidence that the Texans colluded with the Indians to attack the whites. In fact, both sides hired Indians and desperados to attack the other side's logistics supplies, but both sides lost the blame to the other side. The result was that El Paso commander Anthony had undue confidence. He felt that with nearly 2,000 men under his command, and having undergone 2 months of military training, he was fully capable of defending the enemy from outside the country. Anthony did not accept Houston's suggestion, and joined forces with him to defend Austin. Anthony did this for 2 reasons. One was that he had confidence in himself and his troops, and the other was that the El Paso army and Houston's army should have an equal relationship. He did not want to be commanded by Houston. Houston didn't want to fight an entire Mexican army in the middle of the road, so he handed over his troops to his lieutenants. Houston decided to go to the United States in person to meet with President Andrew Jackson and ask him to send troops. The total number of Mexican troops in Texas had reached 12,000. Twice the number in history. Historically, Tazinana led an expedition to Texas with 8,000 soldiers. Although the troops were supplemented after the Battle of the Alamo, due to too many deserters, the total strength was only 6,000. The El Paso regiment was now equipped with America's newest Hawken rifle, a rifled rifle known for its accuracy and power. If the Mexicans and the soldiers of the El Paso Legion were to shoot at each other, Anthony would be very happy. After all, the hit rate of rifled guns is no joke. He would welcome the Mexicans to charge. He had dug countless potholes in the middle of the road to restrict the advance of the infantry, and even built a parapet for himself. Anthony, who had never experienced a war, really didn't know how he could lose, but on the first day of the war, his jaw dropped. Tazanana followed Franz's advice to hold on to the stronghold and fight the war, and began to build fortifications. As soon as he came up, the skirmishers on both sides could only shoot at each other from a distance of 300 meters. Even rifled guns had a very limited hit rate at this distance. The main Mexican troops began to camp a few hundred meters away from the fortifications, and the tents instantly formed a jungle, smoke curling up. Anthony looked at the situation in front of him and punched the parapet. They're here to fight or have a picnic on a hillside. Miss Jenny served freshly cooked lamb to Tazanana's two guests, Gablens and Stadion. Tazanana opened the newspaper and said, "I love this editor so much. He scolds Americans every day. I really admire how many tricks he has." Gablens and Stadion were a little dismissive. "After all, tabloid editors like this are just chasing rumors. Your Excellency, General, should we fire 2 cannons before we eat?" Tazanana called Gablens and Stadion generals. Gablens and Stadion did not want to be involved in a coup in Mexico one day, so they called Tazanana the general, to show that he is just a subordinate of Tazanana. "That's right, sir," ordered the artillery to fire. Tazanana nodded. Gablens ran to the edge and waved a small flag in his hand. He found that this flag language was easier to use than talking. The artillerymen at the foot of the mountain were hiding under the trees and playing cards. When they saw the semaphore on the mountain, they immediately dropped their cards and ran towards the cannon. Boom, boom, boom. Several artillery shells fell on the El Paso Legion's defensive position, and people fled in panic. However, they soon discovered that these artillery shells either hit too far or too close. What was even more frightening was that the opponent had a lot of grenades. There was no explosion, just stayed there quietly. It's no wonder that it's too hot in Texas in the summer, so the artillerymen often water the cannons to cool down, and sometimes they accidentally get the fuses of the artillery shells wet. One more thing, the explosive shells at this time still had a fuse, which often relied on the experience of artillerymen to cut and launch them. As for the explosive needle-fired artillery shells, they were only successfully developed in 1835. Even on the European battlefield, they were difficult to see. It was not until 1860. Later, troops were equipped on a large scale. Damn it. Stop running away. Push up our cannon too, General. Anthony also brought some artillery, but compared to the Mexican artillery, they were even worse. The first shot was too close, and the second shot was overfilled with gunpowder, and 2 guns were directly scrapped. General Anthony had to let the soldiers stop and rest in preparation for a full-scale Mexican attack the next day. However, after a brief exchange of artillery fire on the third day, both sides began to sit in silence. General Anthony looked at the smoke rising from the kitchen opposite, took out his dry food, and took a bite. Damn it, let's see how long they can last if they eat like this every day. At this time, a burst of smoke suddenly appeared in the distance, and the Mexican cavalry dragged a group of bison carcasses back to the camp. Anthony was so angry that he threw the dry food aside. In the evening, Tazanana's 6 heavy siege guns finally arrived. Our friends have been kept waiting for a long time. After 2 additions, Tazanana's army already has 46 cannons, including 40 field guns and 6 siege guns. This kind of firepower is unique in the Americas. Of course, the United States can even out and surpass this gap at any time if it wants, but for the Texas Army, it is still crushing firepower. The battle to decide the fate of Texas is about to begin. I feel that the pacing is slow for all book friends. I will continue to speed up the writing after this battle, but I may miss some historical plots. Thank you Feng Xiaoxi for having a cheap guest. Book friend 160,307,120,545,342. Fireworks Taoist Scriptures. Book friend 2020526094618467. World Weary, Little Scumbag, Jiu Ming 7, asking you how can you be far away and biased, flying leaves are shaping the square moon. Book friends 2019061190303995, FAML, Tau Tau Mu, Fire Dust Reward monthly tickets, as well as the support of all readers also. Please vote and support. Chapter 67 Gentle Slope and Cavalry. On the fourth day, the Mexican cavalry went out as usual. Antony's troops were also supported, with a total strength of 2,500 men and 15 cannons. The two sides had been engaged in a fierce artillery battle since the morning. The sudden increase in the Mexican army's artillery fire caught Anthony by surprise. Looking at the pieces of fallen parapets, Anthony made the same choice as any experienced cowboy on this continent. The El Paso Legion used their caravans to block the gap in the parapet, but did not wait for a full-scale Mexican attack. Anthony dusted himself off and cursed, "Damn Mexicans, Indian bastards, where did they get so many artillery? Let Austin bring more artillery tomorrow." At this time, a scarred cowboy rushed into the camp on horseback. Anthony immediately recognized the other party as Captain Jabba, who was responsible for delivering supplies. "What's going on? Is it an Indian?" "No, Mr. Anthony. It's the Mexican cavalry. They cut off our retreat." "How many are there?" Anthony asked eagerly. "About a regiment," and then Captain Jabba passed out. "Jabba. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar." Anthony was still shouting. This was not because of how good their relationship was, but because the cavalry regiment's gratitude was very vague at this time. The American cavalry regiment may consist of 400 or 500 men. It usually consists of 2 squadrons. Each squadron has 2 companies, and each company has 100 to 125 men. However, in Europe, the French cavalry regiment usually has 4 squadrons and 800 people. The Prussian cavalry regiment usually consists of 5 squadrons, and the Austrian cavalry regiment usually has 7 to 8 squadrons. The Russian cavalry regiment does not have a fixed number of squadrons, including mixed with a large number of Cossacks. The British cavalry regiment numbered 450 men. Anthony could only rely on his own experience. In dealing with Indians, 50 pioneers could deal with 300 Indian warriors. If there were 500 Mexican cavalry, it would be enough to send 300 Texan soldiers. But for safety reasons, General Anthony decided to send the 200 mercenaries as well. After all, they were experts in dealing with Indians. At this time, there were a large number of Indians and Indo-European hybrids in the Mexican army, and these people were called Indians by Americans. The search force sent by Anthony soon discovered the Mexican cavalry on a hillside. At this time, the Americans, due to long-term fighting with the Indians, did not take these saber-wielding cavalry seriously. On the contrary, they felt that in this era, the use of cold weapons was a very ridiculous behavior. Their own cavalry also used pistols and rifles. It was only after 1838 that they began to use cold cavalry revolvers, no longer pressing the hammer. Gablenz was a little surprised on the hillside. It was not that the Texan troops came quickly, but that there were too few. On this inconspicuous hillside, a total of 2,000 Mexican cavalry were stationed. Their purpose was to block enemy reinforcement and prevent the El Paso Legion from escaping. What surprised Gablenz even more was that instead of retreating, this small Texan force advanced along the gentle slope, seemingly intending to capture the hilltop. The search force of the Texas Army was led by Colonel Bob. His idea was very simple: rush up and kill all the Indians. He could take advantage of the range of the rifle. Anyway, the opponent only had sabers. Suddenly there was a hail of bullets flying from the mountain. Colonel Bob touched his forehead, and his hands were covered with blood. How is this possible? Colonel Bob fell heavily to the ground. He couldn't understand why those cavalry had guns. In fact, this is related to the Austrian tradition. The cavalry in the Natalina region was originally dominated by dragoons, and General Gablenz himself was a dragoon commander. It is not surprising that the Mexican cavalry he trained would become dragoons. Gablenz felt that he had a numerical advantage, and he could not be sure whether the opponent's force was a decoy or whether the opponent had follow-up troops. So he first asked the soldiers to dismount and shoot at the enemy, and at the same time, let the reserve team prepare for an assault. However, what he didn't expect was that the opponent was defeated so quickly. They fell into chaos as soon as the battle started and then began to flee. There was a flat Gobi desert in front of them with no hiding place at all, and it was at least 2 kilometers away from the Texan camp. It was impossible for these defeated soldiers to run back. Gablen signaled the messenger to signal, but the cavalry on the side could no longer hold their nerve. After receiving the order, they immediately poured down the hillside. The fleeing El Paso legionnaires were heartbroken when they heard the thunderous sound of horse hooves behind them. Some people wanted to organize a counterattack. After all, it was impossible for a 2-legged man to outrun a 4-legged horse, but those people could only be dragged around by the defeated troops and ran around in the Gobi Desert. Naturally, the Mexican cavalry would not miss this good opportunity to cut wheat. The cavalry slammed into the broken ranks and began to massacre. The defeated soldiers who were left behind had no choice but to run forward desperately if they wanted to survive or pull down their companions to delay the cavalry's pursuit. This scene was very similar to the rolling bead curtain strategy used by the Tang dynasty 1,000 years ago. The 2-kilometer-long flat Gobi Desert destined these defeated soldiers to be unable to escape back to the camp alive. At this time, the commanders of the Texas Army were all colonists and slave owners. They had no war experience. Even the mercenaries only had experience fighting Indian tribes. They don't know the horror of the gentle slope, let alone the horror of the cavalry. The reason why Gabelens chose this kind of hillside as a blocking point was because this terrain was not conducive to local attacks, and it could also give full play to the strengths of his own cavalry. Only a few of the 500 men fled back to the El Paso Legion camp. These men were deliberately let go by Gabelens, whose purpose was to demoralize the El Paso Corps. These soldiers who narrowly escaped death were either silent or shouting non-stop because they had just experienced a horrific massacre and their comrades around them were cut down one by one. The Mexican cavalry did not allow the Texans to surrender, bleeding those who surrendered with their sabers and then followed those who surrendered on horseback, driving them toward the El Paso Legion's camp. Damn it. You can't even deal with those damn Indians. What a bunch of trash. Anthony cursed. Then, what do we do now? I know what to do. There are Mexican artillery and fortifications in front of me, and the rear route is cut off by the opponent's cavalry. What can I do? Damn Houston, why doesn't he come to support me? Anthony actually regretted not being in Austria. Sting defended. The firepower of the Mexican army is much more intense than that of the El Paso army. Now El Paso's position is full of loopholes that cannot be blocked. What worried Anthony the most was the morale issue. Most of these people had never been on the battlefield. If it had been the first 2 days, he could have let these new recruits break through or even attack Tazanana's position head on to defeat them. But now fear, anxiety, and the shadow of death have enveloped the entire army. He can only hope that Houston will send someone to rescue him, and then he will cooperate inside and outside to escape back to Austin. However, the Mexican army did not give him this opportunity. After the shelling stopped, Tazanana's messenger issued an ultimatum to him, demanding that the El Paso army surrender immediately. Anthony saw the red flag raised in the Mexican military camp, and he thought of the legend that, if he did not surrender now, the Mexicans would no longer accept surrender later. At this time, the cavalry team that eliminated Colonel Bob came from the direction of Austin. Anthony discovered that it was not a cavalry regiment, but a cavalry brigade. Anthony knew that he would never leave alive if he did not surrender, so he chose to surrender. It was not that he lacked courage, but that he did not want to make unnecessary sacrifices. Chapter 68 Final Speech. The army of El Paso fought for only 4 days before surrendering, which was completely unexpected by Houston. According to Houston's estimation, even if General Anthony is in trouble, he can still survive for a few months. Previously, more than 100 people could hold out for 16 days at the Alamo, which shows that the Mexicans would not attack the city at all. The El Paso Legion has more than 2,000 people and is supported by volunteers who are constantly arriving from all over the United States. He also left a regiment of troops in Austin to help with the response point, but the El Paso Corps held out for 4 days and lost half of the entire Texas artillery. Austin was also in danger. Houston's main force, including volunteers from Boston, only had 1,500 troops. Now Houston has 2 options. One is to continue to the United States, hoping that the United States can send troops To rescue Austin in time. Point of course, this is almost impossible. Even if the United States sends troops, it is impossible to reach Austin within a few days. If the defenders of Austin really have to wait for American support, I'm afraid that the entire city will have been destroyed before the support arrives. For a piece of scorched earth. Point the second is to return to Austin immediately, collect all supplies and troops along the way, defend Austin, and wait for the United States to send troops for rescue. Point of course, it is very likely that he will be swallowed up by the flames of war like the Alamo Legion and the El Paso Legion before him. Point, but Austin is a fortified city with a high city and ample food and grass. It is also the last barrier to the plains of northern Texas. Once Texas falls, the northern plains will be undefendable. Once the Mexicans have established a foothold in Austin, they will have to pay a huge price if they want to drive the Mexicans out. Point after a fierce ideological struggle, Houston decided to go back and be with his soldiers. Finally, Houston managed to get back to Austin before the Mexicans completely blocked the road to Austin. Point on May 25, 1836, the siege of Austin officially began. Point on May 28th, the southern wall of Austin collapsed. Point on May 30th, the southern walls of Austin fell. Point on June 1st, the Texans recaptured the southern wall. Point on June 2nd, the southern wall fell again. Point on June 3rd, the Texan army once again recaptured the southern wall. Point on June 4th, the Mexican military dug a tunnel, planted explosives under the North City Gate, and blew open the North City Gate. Point on June 5th, the entire walls of Austin fell. Point on June 6th, the Mexican army asked the Austin garrison to surrender, but the Austin garrison refused. That day, the Mexican army shelled the barricades in the city. Point on June 9th, the Mexican army asked Austin citizens to leave the city, and the Texas army asked Austin citizens not to leave their homes. On June 10th, street fighting began. Point due to the tenacious resistance of Austin's defenders, the Mexican army had to search room by room and occupy street by street. Both sides paid a huge price. Point at the same time, this kind of fighting is also a torture for the residents of Austin. Point they don't know when someone will break into their home, steal their food, and take their lives. If they don't resist, they will die. If they pick up a gun to resist, they will be shot to death by soldiers from both sides who think they are hostile. Point on June 15th, the Mexican army suffered more than 3,000 casualties during the siege. Tazanana called for a halt to the attack and ordered the city to be set on fire. Point on June 18th, the fire burned for 3 days and 3 nights. Maybe God couldn't stand it anymore, so it started to rain. Point Houston looked at the drizzle of rain in the sky and the gradually extinguishing fire. He knew that, when the rain stopped, it would be the time for the Mexicans to launch their final attack. Point Houston looked at his men. These men had been fighting continuously for almost a month. Almost everyone was injured, but no one wanted to surrender. This made him very happy. Point here Houston gave his last speech in his life in the Houston Regiment. There were people from Tennessee, people from Boston, people from Texas, rich businessmen, civilians, cowboys, soldiers, Anglo-Saxons, Germans, Jews. You are all true Americans. We are hardworking and strong. Maybe you were once unpopular, but on American soil, you can enjoy equality and freedom. Point we work, reproduce, and enjoy unfettered freedom in this uninhabited land. And now, Mexico's dictator, Tazanana, with his hounds, claims this is Mexican land and they want to take away our land and our freedom. Point we have to fight to the end, and maybe every one of us will die, but the American spirit will live on. Point friends, take care of your comrades, because they will also sacrifice their lives for you. Our enemies are very cruel and cunning, but I promise you that I will fight until the last moment. I will not abandon any brother, nor will I spare an enemy. Point I need some volunteers now. You will join me to hold back the Mexicans and let our compatriots fight out. Someone must know what is going on here. Point God bless America. In the end, about 100 Texans decided to stay and fight to the death with the Mexican army. Point the rain stopped. Gunshots and cannon fire rang out again. Point in front of Austin City Hall, General Houston was covered in blood, facing the Mexican soldiers coming up from the front. His soldiers decided to resist until the last moment, fighting with rifles, bayonets, hands, and teeth. However, the breakout team encountered an ambush by the Mexican army and suffered heavy casualties after the war. The Mexicans cleaned up the battlefield and found hundreds of mutilated corpses in front of City Hall, but no one found the body of General Houston. A day later, someone accidentally caught a Texas deserter wearing civilian clothes in the ruins, but when the deserter was sent to a makeshift prisoner of war camp, someone immediately recognized him as General Houston. Houston sat on the ground without saying a word and was soon taken away by a Mexican officer and 2 Mexican soldiers. Houston thought he might have to face the humiliation of Tazanana, but to his surprise, he saw another person, a person who was supposed to die. Jimmy, long time no see, Mr. Houston. After a few months of not seeing each other, Jimmy has grown taller and tanned and looks like a white indigenous Mexican. Jimmy, I thought you were dead. Yes, I'm dead. After taking that shot, but I should be dead. Jimmy took off his hat and pointed to the scar on his forehead. Jimmy, there's nothing I can do about it. I have forgiven you. After all, you not only abandoned me. If you were not caught this time, you would have abandoned more people. Listen, Jimmy, this is war and we are all victims. Mr. Houston, you said you would fight with us until the end. I hope you can fulfill your promise. Kit, we've already lost. Don't do anything stupid. Houston thought Jimmy would continue to fight the Mexican army and quickly dissuaded him. But Houston completely misunderstood what Jimmy meant. Jimmy walked up to Houston and grabbed Houston's hair. Houston wanted to resist, but was held down by the Mexican soldiers on the side. Jimmy took out a dagger from his shoe and said to Houston, let's be together forever. In another way, then, Jimmy got a new pair of leather shoes, and he couldn't put them down. The Mexican-American war is over. I will write something else tomorrow. Please support. Please vote. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 69, Closing the Net. Tazanana was very angry at the behavior of his men who secretly killed the enemy commander because it affected his honor. Tazanana felt that the man should be hanged in the square as a warning to others, but when he learned what had happened, he only fined Jimmy 100 pesos. There are more important things to do than these. Tazanana. In the previous siege, the Mexican army suffered as many as 4,000 casualties, of which 2,300 were killed in action, and another 700 were injured and unable to continue fighting. Tazanana's generals wanted to pursue the victory and use the undefeated northern plains to quickly expand the results and strive to create an established fact before the United States entered the war. As long as the entire territory of Texas was occupied, the Americans would never send troops again. Reason. Gablens and Stadion felt that the northern plains were undefendable, and the Mexican army had suffered too many losses in previous battles, so they should consolidate their defenses and wait for reinforcement. On July 2, 1836, Tazanana swore to join the Northern Expedition. On July 15, 1836, Mexican troops arrived at Fort Dallas. On July 20, 1836, the United States issued a note asking Mexico to stop attacking Fort Dallas. On July 21, 1836, the US ambassador offered to purchase Texas from Mexico for $450,000. On July 22, 1836, the US ambassador proposed purchasing the Mexican state of California for $550,000. On July 23, 1836, Mexican President Tazanana formally rejected the US proposal. On July 24, 1836, the siege of Fort Dallas began. On July 25, 1836, the United States claimed that a Mexican artillery shell had landed in the United States, resulting in the disappearance of an American soldier. It requested that troops be sent into Mexico to protect foreigners, but the Mexican army refused. On July 26, 1836, the United States declared war on Mexico. On August 1, 1836, the leading American troops arrived at Fort Dallas and had a fierce battle with the Mexican army. The Mexican army lost 700 soldiers and was forced to retreat. The first siege of Dallas ended point on August 15, 1836. 4 U.S. infantry regiments, 2 militia regiments, a cavalry brigade, and an artillery regiment, with a total strength of 8,000 troops, attacked Austin Point on August 25, 1836. The American troops suffered excessive casualties and had to retreat August 30, 1836. Washington Point. Andrew Jackson looked at the financial statements in his hands with a wicked smile on his lips. Gentlemen, please remember this great day. We will solve the two major problems that have always plagued the United States. Mr. Biddle, President of the Second Bank of the United States, and Tazanana, President of Mexico. In 1836, U.S. revenue was expected to reach $61 million, while in 1833 it was only $21 million. All this is of course thanks to the land craze and the wave of railroad construction. However, the Second Bank of the United States has always been a time bomb for the United States. Only by eliminating this money printing monster can Andrew Jackson feel at ease. Point. The United States decided to expand its military by 140,000 troops in response to the ongoing US-Mexico War. For Mexico, which has only 34,000 troops in total, the US's expansion of 140,000 troops is indeed a bit like anti-aircraft artillery to swat mosquitoes, but the Americans had been warned several times by the British, and they also received reliable information that the French were prepared to purchase Texas from the Mexicans. If we are facing a joint attack by Mexico and France, then the 28,000 people in the United States will not be enough. Point. In order to ensure victory in the war, Andrew Jackson used the gold dollar offensive to bribe the forces within Mexico that opposed Tazanana. Point. Andrew Jackson targeted General Jose Ypres, a speculator by trade. He was promised a lot of benefits during the Tazanana coup, but they were not fulfilled after Tazanana came to power. Instead he was sent to the southern border to retire. Point. Afterwards, Tazanana exiled many people who opposed him to southern Mexico. Point. These people were already at odds with Tazanana, and they were naturally eager to try. After receiving the support of the United States. Point. On September 10, 1836, the French ambassador proposed to purchase Texas from Mexico for 50 million francs, but Mexico rejected it. Point. On September 25, 1836, a fierce battle broke out between the United States and Mexico on the plains north of Austin. The Mexican army suffered nearly 1,000 casualties and had to retreat. Point. On October 2, 1836, the Third Battle of Austin began. Point. On October 20, 1836, the American troops withdrew. Point. On October 25, 1836, Mexican General Joseph declared Tazanana a traitor and appointed himself interim president of Mexico. The Mexican Civil War broke out. Point. On October 26, 1836, Mexico announced that it would sell Texas to France for 100 million francs. On October 30, 1836, France entered the Gulf of Mexico and took over Harrisburg, later Port Houston, the second largest port in Mexico at this time. On November 1, 1836, Britain announced that the Royal Navy would escort the French army. Because many plots have been omitted, they will be explained specifically later. In fact, there are also foreshadowings in the past. On November 5, 1836, Jose Ypres rebels severely defeated Vice President Reuvel's government troops in southern Mexico. Point. On November 10, 1836, Jose Ypres rebels besieged Mexico City. Point. On November 12, 1836, French troops took over Austin. Point. On November 15, 1836, France issued an ultimatum to the United States, demanding that the United States withdraw from all of Texas. On November 20, 1836, the US military invaded Austin, and the Fourth Battle of Austin began. Point. On November 22, 1836, the French army annihilated 4 main regiments of the US Army and captured more than 3,000 people. Point. On November 25, 1836, President Andrew Jackson signed a presidential decree to fully mobilize. Point. On December 1, 1836, the US government withdrew $10 million from the Second Bank of the United States to finance the war with France. Point. On that day, Baron Brooke was about to withdraw his last income of $2 million from the bank. Point. As a result, these two payments occurred on the same day. which directly caused the Second Bank of the United States of America to have insufficient liquidity and be unable to make payments. Coupled with the failure on the battlefield, it directly triggered panic among the American people. The run began. Banks went bankrupt, and coins, gold, and silver were robbed. What followed was a collapse in land prices. Within a week, land prices in New York fell by 20%, and in Chicago by 50%. At the same time, European and American agriculture had another bumper harvest, causing crop prices to plummet. The price of US cotton exports dropped by 30% and wheat by 50%. Andrew Jackson had to issue a presidential decree to stop military expansion, and signed a peace treaty with France, recognizing French rule in Texas. The Monroe Declaration is like a piece of waste paper, trampled under the feet of the Americans themselves, while the dollar plummeted. It also detonated the price of the pound. This was naturally due to the frequent trade between Britain and the United States. Of course, France's credit for using the dollar to peg the pound was indispensable. The economic crisis is like a plague, from the United States to the United Kingdom, and then from the United Kingdom to the world. Instead, the Austrian Empire escaped disaster because it had little trade with Britain and the United States, and had long used bond currency. Vienna, trading center due to the impact of the economic crisis. Foreign forces have sold Austrian railway stocks, causing railway stock prices to plummet. Afterwards, Baron Brooke used the money he brought back from the United States to sweep away all railway company stocks on the market. December 25, 1836, Christmas. Austria's railways were all returned to the royal family. At this point, Austria's railways can be considered to have completed the state-owned reform in a sense, and of course, thanks to the financial support of the American railway, because the Christmas girl costume designed by Franz was against religious doctrine. She was put in solitary confinement by Mrs. Sophie. She could only lie down by the window to watch the snow and the moon. Speeding up in every sense of the word. Chapter 70 Aftermath. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz is telling Madame Sophie a bedtime story. Once upon a time there was a bear named Miss Ha. Miss Ha has a friend named Ivan. Miss Ha and Ivan live happily in the forest. One day, Miss Ha saw a fly land on Ivan's face. Miss Ha wanted to help her friend get rid of the flies on his face. So Miss Ha lifted a huge stone and threw it at the fly. Snap, the fly died, but poor Ivan was also crushed to death by kind-hearted Miss Ha. This is a Russian fable that tells us not to do bad things with good intentions, especially when you have powerful abilities. President Andrew Jackson simply ignored his own energy and was obsessed with killing Biddle and his Second Bank of the United States. It's just that, if Andrew Jackson's brick wall continues, it will not only destroy Biddle and his Second Bank of the United States, but also the entire American economy and his ambitious hegemony. Biddle and his Second Bank of the United States were truly a ticking time bomb for the United States. Those banknotes that are not guaranteed by precious metals and commodities are just white notes that may become waste paper at any time. Andrew Jackson had 3 creeds. 1. The most reliable thing is the support of the people. 2. The government cannot be allowed to be hijacked by financial and other powerful institutions. 3. It is very dangerous for the financial industry to open up too much to foreign forces. It is undeniable that Andrew Jackson fought to the end with Biddle, a banker, for the sake of the United States, but he did destroy the American economy. According to Andrew Jackson's original plan, he would withdraw all Federal Reserves from the Second Bank of the United States in 5 installments, and then consign Biddle and his bank to the dustbin of history. Yet, he underestimated his own power and overestimated the ability of the Second Bank of the United States to deliver. In fact, in theory, the Second Bank of the United States should be able to make payments 2 to 3 times, which can delay the economic crisis slightly. However, due to Franz's fueling, this time bomb still exploded. But even without Franz causing trouble, once the US government starts withdrawing coins from banks, it will still trigger a series of chain reactions. All financial giants, business tycoons, and government officials are not fools. They will definitely go to the bank to withdraw money. In history, it only took 1 month for the Second Bank of the United States to lose its ability to pay, while other banks' ability to pay and resist risks was even worse. Banks in this era are all private banks. Once a bank fails, depositors will lose all their money, which undoubtedly exacerbates the tragedy of this financial tsunami. On the other hand, the Bank of New York escaped unscathed because of the suspicious lobby manager, because they always think that someone is watching their position. They do not lend too much, and crazy point of course, they also suffered huge losses during the economic crisis, but these losses were nothing compared to the huge benefits that excellent reputation would bring in the future. The US real estate industry has encountered a cold winter, with US land prices falling by 30% in the first 3 weeks. Speculators from all over the world in the Bank of the United States jointly created the largest economic bubble in the first half of the 19th century. This time, the US real estate economic bubble made Franz earn 67 million florins. Among them, the land with the highest yield was naturally the land in Chicago, which increased 54 times when Franz sold it. Of course, the real estate prices in Boston and Tennessee are also good, but the land in New York has only increased 6 times, which really makes Franz a little disappointed. After all, in Franz's eyes, all speculators in the United States were on Wall Street, so how could it be possible for New York's land prices to lag behind others? In fact, most speculators have seen this bubble, but no one can stop its expansion in the face of huge interests. Some people are still trying to save the US real estate market, and some are unwilling to give up their land in the hope that they can sell it when prices rise. Don't be afraid. This is just a technical adjustment. This is the most common statement heard recently in the New York Trading Center, and most of these people will enter the mental hospital to continue technical adjustments, because this is just the beginning. After that, the prices of these land assets will fall exponentially. In the end, those lands purchased for $15,000 were only waiting for buyers for $100. Of course, the United States is not the biggest loser. Americans have at least paid off their debts, and the United States would not allow itself to become the biggest loser. Soon Martin Van Buren became president in place of the disgraced Andrew Jackson. The first thing he did was to ask all banks to refuse to redeem metal coins. Martin Van Buren just wants to protect the interests of the United States. He doesn't care about speculators, let alone foreigners. These disastrous consequences have to be borne by those foreign investors. This includes our beloved Mr. Friedrich List, whose wealth in the United States was close to $1.8 million at its peak. Yet in the first month of the crisis, he lost nearly a third of his fortune. What is even more frightening is that Mr. Friedrich List used to borrow heavily in order to earn more profits. Now everyone knows that Mr. Friedrich List purchased a large number of non-performing assets in the United States, so they all started to collect debts from him. He had to sell his property in the United States, but no one was willing to pay for it, so he had to borrow usury from the Rothschild family. And one day in the future, Mr. Friedrich List will also pay the price he deserves for his actions today. The real estate industry in the United States was just the beginning. Due to the decline in cotton prices and the decline in the credibility of the US dollar, the British further lowered the purchase price, causing countless farmers to lose their money. The Battle of Texas and the defeat of the US military also caused turmoil in the entire United States. Through the Battle of Austin, the US military realized the huge gap between itself and the top armies in Europe. The pistol cavalry they were proud of were defeated in one battle by the French cavalry, which had various debuffs such as acclimatization, isolation, and helplessness. The French army was also able to pursue the remnants of the American army unscrupulously because of the victory of the cavalry on the flank. Before the US military fought against the French army, they never thought that rifled guns would lose to smoothbore guns. In fact, there are many reasons for the failure of the US military. For example, too many troops were lost in siege battles. The French army had better performance and more artillery, as well as stricter discipline and more capable commanders. However, the battle with the French army still brought a great shock to the US military. Especially when the US military had a numerical advantage, the French army still chose to take the initiative and completely defeated the US military. The French army's use of artillery and its combination of scattered and column tactics made the US military feel desperate. The French army used artillery to clear the way, and the skirmishers took advantage of the smoke to continuously attack and kill the American skirmishers. When the smoke cleared, the French army's devastating volleys also made the American army despair, and the bayonet charge and the outflanking cavalry made the American army desperate. Nightmare point. The US military strongly recommends increasing military spending, sending military observers to Europe, updating equipment, and redeeming prisoners. However, President Martin Van Buren's answer was only 2 words: no money. The Bank of England still had £9 million in gold reserves in May 1836. However, in the following days, it decreased at a rate of £700,000 per month. Bank of England Governor Palmer has repeatedly warned the British government that we have too many dollar bills and we must do something to curb its growth. However, the British government was immersed in the huge profits brought by the textile industry, and no one was willing to reduce trade with the Americans. The sharp increase in redemptions in December forced this long-established bank to close down. It also means the outbreak of the British economic crisis thanks to Master Teresa, S. Yundang Beifang, and quantum mechanics for their awards and book friends. 202104252257588893, book friends 20170929104451757. Book friends 202102072015211140. Flowery, these early middle schools, Wuxi Shenwu, 35,271 monthly tickets, and all readers support. Please vote and support. Comments are a little busy recently, so the reply will be slower. Chapter 71 Aftermath. In order to cope with the current bank run frenzy, Britain had to continue to increase exports in exchange for more coins. However, both France and the German states have raised trade barriers to prevent the British from taking the opportunity to dump goods. This weakened Britain's ability to consume cotton, and Britain's weakened ability to consume cotton exacerbated the economic crisis. The largest cotton purchaser in the United States, Herman Brennan, declared bankruptcy, and subsequently more companies in cotton-related industries went bankrupt. Looking at the bankruptcy report like snowflakes in front of him, Martin Van Buren sat in the carriage made of the wooden boards of the US Constitution frigate, and his heart was filled with despair. Martin Van Buren didn't know where to go, and to make matters worse, the Texans readily accepted his new identity as French. In France's first battle back in North America, it severely damaged the arrogant US military, instantly making the rednecks of Texas fall in love with it and shout "Long live France." That's right, rednecks who speak American French can be seen everywhere where the French army passes. The scene of eating a pot of pulp to welcome the King's army made Texas Governor Gabriel feel like he had returned to the Napoleonic era. When he followed General Napoleon through the Arc de Triomphe, the people welcomed him in this way. Later, the First Empire fell, and Gabriel was expelled by the royalists and cast aside by the people. During the July monarchy, Louis Philippe reinstated him, but Gabriel could only be a dog of the Orleans family, suppressing uprisings everywhere. He was called a butcher and executioner. This kind of treatment today was something Gabriel could never dream of, and it made Gabriel feel very good. This move by the rednecks inadvertently saved their lives. France's colonial policy was more cruel than that of the British. Not only did they want to plunder wealth and monopolize trade, they also implemented a tough policy of national assimilation. It is almost impossible to support agents like the British did. The French often choose to completely eliminate all resistance forces. This is related to the needs of the two countries. Britain is an island country with strong industrial strength and needs a vast product dumping ground. France itself has a huge market and can radiate its power into the European continent. What it needs more is the origin of raw materials. In order to better suppress the resistance forces in the colonies, French colonial governors had very great powers. The performance of the rednecks today moved Gabriel very much. He wanted to use Texas as a starting point to rebuild the glory of New France. Governor Gabriel announced to the rednecks, all persons residing in the French colonies, regardless of color, are French nationals and enjoy all the rights provided for in the Constitution. Every person who is born free or acquires liberty in a French colony enjoys 1. Civil rights, 2. political rights provided for by law. Moreover, in order to win over people's hearts, Gabriel implemented a lower tax rate than in mainland France, and ensured that no businessman could monopolize trade. He retained the existing property of the rednecks, and if the rednecks wanted to continue cultivating the land they only had to pay a fee to the French colonial government. Of course, Gabriel also had his request. That is, all Texans must send their children to Catholic schools established in France to learn French. There is nothing wrong with learning French, but Catholic schools disgust the rednecks. Some rednecks immediately suggested that they could pay to build their own schools to learn French. Governor Gabriel agreed to the rednecks' request, but all children were required to attend school before 1840. This is Governor Gabriel's bottom line, and the rednecks also know it, so naturally they dare not violate it. Governor Gabriel also asked Texans to form the Texas Self-Defense Force. The officers would be personally appointed by the governor, and would be mainly volunteers. However, if the number was insufficient, the colonial government had the right to conscript those who were conscripted. People can use money to let others do the work for them. In fact, Governor Gabriel does not need to worry about this. The rednecks admire the powerful French army very much. After all, the Mexicans they could not defeat were beaten by the US military in the city, and the French army killed the US military as soon as they arrived. The 3,000 American prisoners of war are still working on the plantations instead of black slaves, which is the best proof. When the Mexican army retreated, almost all the blacks chose to abandon their property and follow Tazanana's army. So after the war, Texas slave owners couldn't find a single slave at all. Since the slave trade is prohibited in France, slave owners hope to get their slaves back. After all, those slaves were originally their own property. The US military also promised it before, but now the US military is captured. Governor Gabriel felt this was a good opportunity. He recognized slavery in Texas, and wrote to the cabinet saying that this was a Texan tradition, and should be respected. In fact, the French cabinet didn't care about this at all. Slavery was limited to Texas, and not in the mainland, so the Catholic priests wouldn't have any objections. Governor Gabriel wanted to take back those black slaves from Mexico, but he was rejected by Tazanana. Governor Gabriel's messenger even found a black officer standing next to Tazanana. In the end, he could only flee back to Texas angrily to tell Gabriel. As a result, Governor Gabriel distributed the American prisoners of war who had not paid ransom to the Texas slave owners as compensation for the loss of their black slaves. France's ambitions are far more than just Texas, and this is just the beginning. For this reason, France decided to immigrate 100,000 people to Texas. Of course, even if another 200,000 people immigrated to Texas, the land in Texas would be enough. This is why Governor Gabriel must form the Texas Self-Defense Force. For France, one Texas is not enough. They want Louisiana, Wyoming, Oregon, Quebec, and all of North America to surrender to France. This financial tsunami had little impact on the Austrian Empire. On the contrary, it had a considerable impact on Austria's international financiers, especially the Rothschild family. Due to the plummeting land prices in the United States, they had a lot of bad debts, and even many loans were lost. Some people lose everything, while others make a lot of money. This included Archduke Karol. As the richest nobleman in Austria, after receiving Franz's letter, he immediately used his funds to purchase Austrian railway stocks without any hesitation. Finally, the railway from Vienna to Venice was purchased for 15 million florins. However, Archduke Karol was not satisfied. Like Francis II, he considered himself an Italian. He planned to build a railway to Tuscany to make it easier for him to return home. Archduke Karol's butlers stopped his crazy behavior. After all, in the eyes of the butlers, it was no different from using money to waste money, and it was not even as affordable as buying some works of art. As for why they were stewards, it was because there were 500,000 people working for Archduke Karol's family, and just one steward was really not enough. 1836, Christmas Eve. Looking out the window at Thalia, who was wearing a fiery red velvet jacket paired with a fiery red top and a short skirt. Franz really didn't know how she violated the doctrine. Oh, and there was also a pointy red hat. Thalia was carrying a bag and climbed up to Franz's window along the sheets. "Here, a Christmas gift, Franz." opened the bag, and found that it contained the remaining funds for the acquisition of the railway. This is my money. Chapter 72 Polish-style free grant system. Schönbrunn Palace, Franz room. I don't want to give you a surprise, Thalia said. Okay, then why are you dressed like this? Franz asked. Thalia frowned. Do you think I can still climb up here if I'm wearing a formal dress? Don't you know how to walk through the door? Then it's not a surprise. Aren't you tired carrying such a big bag of money? Thalia looked at Franz sharply. It's not you. I have to change it into expected money. 7 million, a whole 10 kilograms. I'm exhausted. Franz had some money left after buying the railroad at the bottom. Baron Brooke once offered to take care of it for Archduke Franz Carol, but Franz refused. It's not that Franz doesn't believe in Baron Brooke, but that Franz has other plans, and no amount of money is enough. The anticipatory note is a currency developed in Austria that is similar to a bond. The largest denomination is 1000 florins, which is what Thalia carries in her bag. Franz walked behind Thalia and squeezed her back. How did that go? Oh, it's already 77 or 88. Really? The yield of those wheats has increased? Franz asked excitedly. No, they're all dead. Thalia replied calmly. Maybe they can't stand the humiliation. This is the first time I've heard that wheat can also be hybridized. The professors at the University of Vienna followed your method and put paper bags on the wheat ears, whose stamens were removed. After a few months, all the wheat died. Now, there are still 160 seeds left. Do you want to continue? In fact, this method was also found by Franz from a certain time travel book, but this technology seems immature and the success rate is a bit low. Leave 20 seeds for harvesting and continue with the rest. Franz had plenty of time anyway, so if he couldn't do it in 1 year, 2 years would be enough. Once hybrid wheat is completed, it will be a huge improvement for Austria, nay, for the entire world's agriculture. Poland's nationalist free-for-all system is a perfect way to describe extreme democracy. If anything goes to extremes, the consequences that follow will be difficult to control. For example, Poland's king selection system ruined the entire kingdom of Poland. And now Poland's extreme democracy in the military will destroy their elite team. Jenny was opposed to the Polish Nationalist Army's decision to establish a branch in Vienna. Because she really couldn't figure out why Vienna, the enemy's base camp, was chosen to establish a branch of the Nationalist Army. Is it because he's afraid that he won't die quickly enough? Or that the enemy won't find out? In fact, the last assassination in Frankfurt was originally very successful, but afterwards, in order to increase their influence, the top brass of the Polish Nationalist Army actually admitted the incident, forcing Jenny and her sisters to flee in confusion. But due to absolute democracy, she also had to obey the orders of the Polish Restoration Committee. Jenny could only take her sisters and sneak into Vienna, preparing to infiltrate inside. However, beyond her expectation, their infiltration was so smooth that she thought it was a trap. In fact, Vienna is an almost undefended city. No one cares about your race or nationality, nor your beliefs. Jenny even saw a Protestant church opposite the Catholic Church, and a Jewish church in an inconspicuous corner next door. Regarding the information about the Austrian Empire, Caroline only spent 1000 florins to learn it from a man who claimed to be the leader of the Austrian secret police. However, for the sake of safety, Jenny still asked Caroline to kill the secret police leader with a vase. But soon, Jenny discovered that her approach was redundant. Because in Vienna, as long as you are willing to pay, these secret police can help you find out any information you want, and can even help you arrange accidental encounters with some high-ranking officials at a banquet. Jenny encountered Prince Metternich, one of the core powers of the Austrian Empire. Jenny was originally from a noble family, with an elegant temperament. She was well educated and a beauty. She quickly impressed the European Prime Minister, but Jenny hadn't thought of how to ask him for a piece of absolutely safe territory. Just when Jenny was racking her brains and couldn't think of a way, another powerful figure in Austria, Count Korolaf, found her and said that he could help her get an absolutely safe stronghold, on the condition that it be his partner at the ball at Prince Metternich's house. Jenny doesn't know the other party's true intentions, nor does she know whether the other party's words are true or false, but she has participated in this dangerous game countless times, and is fascinated by it. As her contacts with Prince Metternich and Count Korolov increased, Jenny frequently appeared in Vienna's upper-class social circles. Soon Jenny became a hot new star in the upper class with her extraordinary talent and beautiful appearance. Jenny's identity as a French exiled nobleman adds a sense of mystery to her. The daughter of a troubled nobleman, forced by life to become a dancer, finally fights back and returns to the upper class, which is a topic full of topics. These legendary stories of Jenny also made Thalia become her little fangirl. At Thalia's insistence, Franz met this legendary beauty for the first time. Jenny is highly recognizable, with long pale blonde hair, delicate facial features, and shiny white skin. She stands out, as if she is standing under a spotlight. Jenny's facial features were already extremely beautiful, but her eyes lit up her entire facial features. Franz had never seen more beautiful eyes. The shimmer of light dotted on her dark blue eyes, like stars or the sea. A long black dress can be dignified, coquettish, and seductive, like a beauty stepping out of an oil painting. Thalia and Franz's mother, Mrs. Sophie, are both beauties of this era. Thalia stared at Jenny for a long time, feeling a little embarrassed, and wanted to pull Franz to sit next to her, but found Franz staring blankly at her, and complained to Mrs. Sophie, "Mrs. Sophie, Archduke Franz can't walk anymore, madam." Sophie came over and hit Franz on the head with her fan. "You've been like this since you were a child. Whenever you see someone with long hair, you can't walk." Franz always felt that the other person was looking at him, and he was a little distracted for a moment. Franz was hit, covering his head and looking at Mrs. Sophie aggrievedly. Mrs. Sophie opened the folding fan with a swish, covered half of her face, and spoke softly. "Franz, you need a little courage to strike up a conversation with a strange lady." Then he pushed Franz behind him, but Franz refused to move. Although Franz was a child in body, his soul was not. He desperately wanted to avoid embarrassment. Chapter 73. No Poland. Vienna, Prince Metternich's residence. Since arriving in Vienna, Jenny seems to have returned to that carefree time. Wandering around various dance parties and tea parties every day, I witnessed the jealousy, drunkenness, and death between all kinds of men and women. A lot of sweeties are obsessed with her and fight for her, but Jenny is no longer the 16-year-old girl. The 6 years of wandering life have made her accustomed to the wind and rain, and she no longer wants to see anyone because of her. Bleeding for such meaningless things, Jenny stopped several duels, which earned her a reputation for kindness, but also earned her some jealousy. Soon there were rumors that the duel was staged and just some show. There were even more vicious rumors that she was a prostitute and the one with the highest price got it. Jenny didn't care about these rumors. She just felt that human life should not be wasted on such things. The Battle of Warsaw was an unforgettable experience for her. In the first 5 months, the Polish army won 15 consecutive battles and wiped out 30,000 Russian troops. Everyone was very excited. Everyone felt that Tsar Nicholas I would accept peace and that the restoration of Poland was in sight. But this is not enough to offset the huge gap between Poland and Russia. Tsar Nicholas I's approach to Poland was simple, crude, direct, and effective. If 30,000 didn't work, he would send 50,000. If 50,000 didn't work, he would send 100,000. 3 months later, there was no food in the city of Warsaw, and even the wild vegetables had been dug up. The Polish soldiers fired all the bullets in their guns, but the Russians fired more and more. The European powers at that time had different attitudes towards this uprising. Prussia was afraid of the expansion of the influence of the Polish uprising, so it sent troops to blockade the Polish border. In Silesia alone, it confiscated 10,000 rifles and gunpowder worth £100,000 and arrested thousands of volunteers who were preparing to go to Warsaw to fight against Russia. An agreement was even signed with Russia, and the Russian army was responsible for suppressing the Polish uprising. The agreement stipulates as follows. First, Prussia will complete the construction of a bridge before the Russian army crosses the Vistula River. Second, the city of Torun will be used as a base for the Russian army, and Torun will provide weapons, ammunition, and food to the Russian army. Third, if the war is delayed or fails, Prussian territory will be open to the Russian army and the safety of the Russian army will be guaranteed. Although British Foreign Secretary Palmerston verbally condemned Russia's atrocities and expressed his willingness to sell weapons and ammunition to the Poles, the prerequisite was that the Poles must buy them with real money and pay in advance. In France, Louis Philippe, who had just ascended the throne, was sympathetic to the Poles in his heart and was very grateful that the Polish uprising attracted Russian firepower. This allowed the July monarchy, which came to power through the revolution, to avoid the possibility of Russian interference. But being a coward, Louis Philippe immediately sent an ambassador to assure the Tsar that the French government would unswervingly abide by the terms of the Congress of Vienna. French Foreign Minister Sebas even coldly rejected Warsaw's request. During his visit to Paris, Russian Foreign Minister Nisolov repeatedly declared that the Polish issue was Russia's internal affair, and any attempt to intervene would be regarded by His Majesty the Great Tsar as an act of hostility to Russia. Nisolov's arrogant attitude made French government officials indignant, but Louis Philippe did not want or dare to intervene in the Polish issue. Given Louis Philippe's weak attitude, the cabinet would naturally not agree to intervene in the Polish uprising. Only Austria's attitude was different, and Francis II's warning to Russia was nothing more than fart. Austria is deeply uneasy about Russia's expansion in the Balkans and hopes to divert the disaster eastward and weaken Russia through Poland. That's right. Instead of closing its borders, Austria chose to open its doors wide. Not only can the Poles enter and exit the Austrian border at will, but Austria also allows volunteers and arms dealers from other countries to enter and exit at will. The Austrian army even started business directly on the border, selling ordnance, food, medicine, and military training, if necessary, to Poles and volunteers. As a result, a large number of armed personnel entered Poland from Austria. Of course, when Poland was defeated, a large number of armed personnel fled into Austria, causing turmoil in Galicia for more than 10 years. In the end, the city of Warsaw was captured. Russian soldiers broke into Ajana's home, killed her parents, set the house on fire, and she was dragged into the street by the soldiers. Fortunately, a friend of Ajani arrived in time. This friend was a Russian colonel. He stopped the soldiers' atrocities and saved Ajani. Later, with the help of the Russian friend, Ajani moved to Paris. During her time in Paris, the Russian friend wrote to her every month and supported her with 100 rubles. At this time, a Russian soldier's annual income was 38 rubles, a cow cost 80 rubles, a girl serf earned 300 rubles, and a colonel of the Guards Corps earned 700 rubles. Ajana's life was relatively prosperous, and she even had money to go to the opera. But one day she saw a beggar wearing a Polish military uniform at the door of the opera house. After some searching, Ajani discovered that many Poles had fled to Paris. She was very happy to meet so many compatriots in a foreign country. However, most people did not live well. Due to the loss of land and property in Poland, most Polish soldiers could only support themselves by doing coolies and doing part-time jobs for others. Some widows even had to sell themselves in order to survive. Ajani began to help these people, but 1 ruble could only buy 10 250-gram baguettes. She quickly ran out of money and later had to sell her jewelry and old clothes. But there was simply not enough. At this time, there were approximately 10,000 Polish exiles in Paris, the vast majority of whom had no stable source of livelihood. So Ajani found those Polish officers and politicians in exile. She wanted to form a Polish restoration army and give these people a home. Later, the widows of Polish officers were organized by Ajani to cooperate with the actions of the Polish restoration army, accumulate funds for the Polish restoration army, and gather intelligence. Engaging in this arduous but glorious work allowed the women in the Zionist army to regain their self-esteem, and they decided to establish 3 knightly orders with the pansy, the national flower of Poland, as their symbol. They are violets, tulips, and edelweiss, corresponding to the 3 colors of pansies, purple, yellow, and white. The 3 knights were sent to Austria, Prussia, and Russia, the 3 countries that participated in the partition of Poland. The intention was obviously to use the enemy's money to fight against the enemy. Of course, the ideal is plump and the reality is skinny. Except for Ajani's Violet, who is prosperous in Vienna, the first 3 generations of tulip leaders are already fighting landlords in Prussian prisons, while Edelweiss is in Siberia, digging potatoes in the ice and snow. Ajani has obtained an absolutely safe territory as the Vienna branch of the Polish Nationalist Army. The top brass of the Polish Nationalist Army have not stopped seeking death, and have assigned some new impossible tasks, but there is a bigger problem at hand that bothers Ajani. The destruction of Poland taught the Sisters of the Violet Knights a lot, including enduring hardship and being strong. However, the luxurious and glitzy life in Vienna awakened the original memories of their bodies, and soon some of them chose to perish. Many sisters even chose to quit the Polish Restoration Army, directly find a good man to marry, and forget about this past. Please vote. Please support. Chapter 74 Idiot, Genius and Madman. But now, Ajani has a new mission. The top brass of the Polish Nationalist Army received accurate information, and Archduke Franz Karol brought 7 million expected banknotes into Schönbrunn Palace. The top management decided to let the Violet Knights take over the mission to find out and find Franz Karol's money. This money was used to support the widows and their children of the victims of the Polish uprising in 1830. To help them survive their difficulties, and to be reserved to fund the restoration of Poland. Ajani's Violet Knights eliminated those who wanted to forget their past after getting married, and there were still 23 people. 6 of them had special status, and were temporarily unable to participate in the operation, and 2 others who were injured were also unable to participate. Among the remaining members of the order was a young girl she particularly liked, named Caroline. But rather than using intelligence to deal with her opponents, she prefers to kill them physically. The vases and porcelain are Caroline's weapons, and they are very effective when used to hit people. However, each time they are used, a large amount of physical evidence will be left at the scene. Caroline had no problem pretending to be a prostitute in a dark alley, or working as a waitress in a noisy bar, but it was too much for Caroline to wander around in the upper class and make excuses with the nobles. In fact, Archduke Franz Karol welcomed him as long as he drank. Ajani herself was very dissatisfied with the top management of the Polish Nationalist Army. Over the years, she and her Sisters of the Violet Knights tried every means to raise funds for the Polish Nationalist Army. They sometimes pretend to be a song and dance troupe. They can perform songs and dances. They can also rob homes. They can also deceive, and they can set up traps. It can be said that they do everything possible. But those politicians and military officers who keep saying they want to restore the country are just enjoying the benefits brought by their good reputation. Some even use the funds of the Restoration Army to keep mistresses in Paris and live a life of luxury. The war has ended 5 years ago. The senior officials have never thought about going to war with Russia. They just keep borrowing money from everywhere in the name of the Polish Restoration Army and letting those who are interested in restoring the country do dirty things for them. These people have long forgotten the hatred between the country and the family, and have long forgotten those compatriots who are still digging potatoes in Siberia. But Ajani still accepted this task because these 7 million florins can allow the Polish people in exile to live a good life for a few years. As one of the leaders of the Polish Restoration Army, she will definitely speak at high-level meetings, give those poor people the rights they deserve. The Polish Nationalist Army now has 3,000 men in name, but it needs to work for the livelihood of 20,000 exiles. Archduke Franz Karol. Some people say he is an idiot, some say he is a genius, and now even more people say he is a hidden careerist. However, people in Vienna generally believed that the Archduke was a madman. After all, a genius who is incomprehensible as a madman. Archdeacon Franz would hunt for wild boars on the streets of Vienna with a shotgun. He could also silence a social elite under the gaze of tens of thousands of people. He would be despised by the homeless people on the street, to be worshipped by someone as proud as Lord Brooke. Ajani had met Archduke Franz Karol several times. This man seemed to only care about wine and nothing else. If so, it must be hunting. This kind of person would be an easy target for assassination, because he would often break away from the team and go hunting in different places. But it was not easy to get the money from Franz Karol. After all, stealing the Grand Duke's money and kidnapping an heir to the throne were 2 completely different things. Moreover, the guards of Archduke Franz Karol will not be easily taken over. Ajani has also heard some rumors about Archduke Franz Karol. That is, he used 3 million florins to earn 67 million in the United States. Not US dollars, but converted into florins used in Austria, and successfully escaped from the top point. Not only did it make a lot of speculators and bankers bankrupt, but it also gained the admiration of countless economists afterwards. All 67 million in coins and precious metals were deposited in the Austrian Imperial Chartered Bank. The Chartered Bank of the Austrian Empire is not a certain bank, but a financial freak created in a special period. It performs many functions of a central bank, but it cannot be called a central bank. To be precise, it should be a monster that emerged after a compromise between a group of financiers hired by Austria and domestic bankers. This 67 million in real money immediately boosted Austria's confidence in banks, so the run on banks did not last long in Austria. Later, he used the expected money in exchange to go all out in the Austrian stock market with another Archduke Karl, and successfully bought the Austrian railway. At the bottom point, Franz Karl bought the stock at 1/3 of its peak, and a week after the purchase the stock returned to its high price point. What Ajani admired most was not the Grand Duke's successful bargain hunting and making huge profits, but the Grand Duke's courage. In the financial tsunami, no one wants to take the risk of depositing money in the bank. Because most of the banks at this time were private, depositors would lose all their money if they failed. And he was willing to take such a huge risk and put a huge fortune in the bank. You must know that although Archduke Franz Karl is a member of the royal family and the imperial government belong to two completely different concepts. He can do many things with the money, spend time and money, and even buy everything he wants. Ajani admired this spirit of taking risks and dedicating herself to the country. She couldn't help but think about how great it would be if the senior leaders of the Polish Nationalist Army also had this spirit. In fact, what Ajani didn't know was that after the money was deposited in the Austrian Imperial Chartered Bank, a large number of creditors came to collect debts. However, the consistent attitude of the Austrian Imperial Chartered Bank was to first pay interest on a portion of the expected banknotes upon maturity. We'll talk about what's due later, and these expected money will not be paid in one lump sum, but in batches within 10 years. It was precisely because Franz knew about this rogue operation of the Austrian Imperial Chartered Bank that he dared to deposit the money without any scruples, and was not afraid that someone would withdraw the money to save Prussia or France. You must know that it was precisely because of this rogue approach that the Austrian Imperial government was saved from bankruptcy and even killed a large number of creditors. Now that the Austrian Railway Company has money and the backing of the royal family, it naturally resumes construction with great fanfare. At this time, the construction of the 3 railways from Vienna to Dresden, Vienna to Graz, and Graz to Udine had been completed. Among them, the railway to Dresden is the busiest railway in the entire Austrian Empire, and even the entire German Saals Union. Railways have reduced transportation costs by 60%. The journey that used to take 10 days now only takes half a day. At this rate, the railway from Prague to Bayreuth in Bavaria and the railway from Udine to Venice will be completed next year. As a result, Austria's German Northern Railway is basically completed, and the railway to Venice will further strengthen Austria's control over northern Italy. Chapter 75 Accident. Ajani was still thinking about how to get close to Archduke Franz Karl. Ajani once tried to create a chance encounter, but Archduke Franz Karl was one of the few men who could completely ignore her. Usually there are only 2 types of people who can do it. One is the careerist with strong ambitions, and the other is the idiot with a mind as clear as crystal. Usually people with simple minds are more likely to be driven by instinct and are more likely to be attracted to beautiful women. Today, Ajani and Archduke Franz Karl encountered again. Although Ajani's instinct told her that the Archduke Franz Karl in front of her belonged to the latter, but after hearing those rumors, she had to consider that the other person might be a bottomless careerist. The wife of Archduke Franz Karl seems to be there as well. The rumors about Mrs. Sophie can be summed up in one sentence: the only man in the Habsburg family, Ajani, doesn't know whether those rumors are true or false, but she feels that such controlling women are usually unhappy. The happiness they create is like Rupert's tears, seemingly invulnerable, but catching weaknesses can be broken by pinching them, and this is what she is best at. Ajani looked at Archduke Franz Karl. He was still drinking wine and enjoying himself. The little kid next to him seemed to be staring at her closely, and there seemed to be some strange things in his eyes. Something which made her feel a little uncomfortable. But Jenny concealed her displeasure very well and just smiled lightly in return. At this time, Mrs. Sophie sighed, closed the fan with a pop, and shined it on Franz's head again. That won't do, Franz. How can a boy lack courage? Watch carefully. After speaking, Mrs. Sophie stood up and walked towards Jenny. Jenny felt that the temperature around her dropped sharply, the light seemed to dim, and the noise in the entire venue became much quieter. The woman in front of her is wearing a luxurious dress, and her face is delicate yet majestic. Her neck is long and slender, her collarbones are distinct, and she looks elegant and smart. Her beautiful brown hair is the most popular curly hair in South Germany, giving her a kind of tenderness as a young woman. And there is a kind of pride that people dare not look directly at. Jenny immediately thought of who the person in front of her was. She lifted up the hem of her skirt and bowed respectfully. Good evening, Madam Sophie. It is an honor to meet you, Mrs. Sophie stretched out her slender arms and said, hello, pretty lady, may I dance with you, Mrs. Sophie's words sounded particularly clear to Jenny, and it seemed that the entire venue fell silent. In fact, the moment Mrs. Sophie stood up and walked towards Jenny, many people in the venue noticed. Jenny is unaware of her reputation as the widowmaker among ladies at the ball. All the ladies stared at Jenny, fearing that she would get close to their husbands or sons more than once. A noble lady wanted to rush in front of Jenny and teach the witch a lesson. However, due to various reasons, this never happened. But this time Jenny miscalculated. Just when she was thinking about how to better attract the attention of Archduke Franz Karl, Mrs. Sophie actually took the initiative. With strong curiosity and a mood to watch the excitement, the ladies abandoned their dance partners and focused their attention on these two people. Jenny's fans wanted to stop Jenny, but were intimidated by Madame Sophie's powerful aura. Several young boys who wanted to step forward to stop were stopped by Madame Sophie's attendants. Even Prince Metternich and Count Korolov find it very difficult. If it were anyone else, they would not be afraid. However, this matter involves the royal family. Once it is revealed that it will not end well, they can only pray for Jenny. The men stopped talking, and even the musicians stopped playing. Jenny was a little stunned. It was the first time for her to be invited by the same sex in a formal occasion. At the same time, she was horrified by Mrs. Sophie's aura and beauty, and her brain was short-circuited for a moment. Stretch out your hand. Mrs. Sophie's tone left no room for doubt. Jenny then handed her hand to Mrs. Sophie in a mysterious way. Mrs. Sophie turned her head to look at Franz, and blinked. Franz was a little helpless. Was this his mother teaching him how to pick up girls? Thalia looked very excited as she watched Mrs. Sophie and Jenny holding hands together. Archduke Franz Karl was still studying the proportions of wine. Jenny was obviously mistaken. She thought that Mrs. Sophie was looking at Archduke Franz Karl just now, and the purpose of dancing with her was to give herself a show of strength and keep Jenny away from her husband. Being both women, this actually aroused Jenny's fighting spirit. Okay, Madam Sophie, Jenny's voice was neither humble nor arrogant, which Mrs. Sophie admired very much. There were few men who did not avoid her sharpness in front of her aura. The two walked to the center of the dance floor, and everyone naturally made way for the two beauties. Music, said Madame Sophie, quietly, but the musicians sprang into action. Chopin's serenade is beautiful and elegant, and the two people in the middle of the dance floor are elegant and graceful. Jenny looked directly into Madame Sophie's eyes, and Madame Sophie looked directly into Jenny's eyes. Jenny's eyes were full of stubbornness, but Mrs. Sophie's eyes were full of greed. This made Jenny feel a little strange. At the moment, when Jenny lost her mind, Mrs. Sophie quickly made a spinning movement. Mrs. Sophie looked at her son, and Franz was covering his face, but their eyes still met between Franz's fingers. Mrs. Sophie commented with a smile, prudery. Suddenly, Jenny felt a strong force on her waist. She was hugged tighter by Mrs. Sophie, and their chests were almost touching. Jenny wanted to escape from the clutches of the devil, but due to the identity of the other party, it was of no avail and she could only be at the mercy of others. Madame Sophie's scorching gaze struck again. The oppressive feeling Madame Sophie brought to Jenny made her a little breathless, and she also lost the courage to continue to look at Madame Sophie point ever since. Jenny lowered her head like a shy little girl and followed Mrs. Sophie's dance steps. Mrs. Sophie smiled at Franz with great satisfaction. Everyone thought that Mrs. Sophie was showing off her victory to Archduke Franz Karol. Mrs. Sophie danced very well, and Jenny also cooperated very well. However, Jenny felt that Mrs. Sophie's hands were not very honest and her movements were a bit too manly, but she enjoyed this feeling very much. Unknowingly, after dancing, Jenny stumbled a little, and Mrs. Sophie stretched out her hand in time to pull her up. Franz Karol's attendant tapped him twice with his elbows to indicate that Mrs. Sophie was looking this way. Franz Karol looked up and saw Madame Sophie and subconsciously felt what he should do. But he was so drunk that he didn't know what to do, so he just clapped. The people around saw the Grand Duke applauding and applauded too. Jenny had never encountered anything like this before. She was a little confused. She clearly wanted to get close to Archduke Franz Karol, but now she was targeted by Madame Sophie. What should she do with this mission? However, something even more unexpected happened to her. Mrs. Sophie pulled Franz over. Miss Jenny, I hope you can be my son's attendant. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.